could start off in maybe just that annoying way. People could just briefly introduce themselves, 10 seconds or less, around the table, because the second half will hopefully be question-answer, or what looks to be more like the final third at this point, if that makes sense. Can we begin here?
Sure. I'm Adam. I'm not really a member of Platypus, but I come to the reading groups, weekly. I'm a student at Temple, and I'm kind of just here because I'm interested in, philosophy and what Platypus has to offer as a forum for the left.
My name's Christy. I was introduced to reading Platypus in the fall of 2010, and I'm now a member of Platypus in Philadelphia.
I'm Joyce. I'm a student at Temple University, a member of Platypus, and perhaps.
My name's Peter, and I'm a student at Temple. Friends with pretty much most guys here. I come over here.
My name is Renee. I used to be a student at Temple. I'm friends with them.
Scott.
I'm Ben. I'm a participant in the Platypus reading group. I am not a student anywhere anymore.
I'm Steve. I'm a Temple student at Temple, and I come to the reading groups as well.
I'm Travis. I'm a student at Temple, and I've been attending the reading groups for maybe 2 months now. I like it.
I'm Scott. I'm involved in Platypus here in Philadelphia, and I've come for the free food and drinks provided by Yale University. And my name's Greg.
So let me just begin by explaining what the purpose of today is. I'm James Vaughn, and I lead the summer reading group of Platypus New York City. And we've been doing a lecture series in New York City. Well, as Greg described, there's a reading group that's been going on this summer called Radical Bourgeois Philosophy. And in New York, we've been running a lecture series along with that. It's a 4-part lecture series. And due to a technical difficulty, we couldn't get a copy of the second lecture. And Greg had very kindly earlier invited me to come down and speak on the origins of the American Revolution. And so what this is a kind of attempt to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, to both do the second lecture of the 4-part series and to do something on the origins of the American Revolution. Extremely broadly conceived. The American Revolution will come in at the very end. So it's really the long-term origins of the American Revolution. What the lecture series is History of Humanity. A few weeks ago, we had the first lecture, which was History of Humanity pre-1600, basically from the dawn of the species to the onset of the 17th century. Of course, that's really not true. I mean, you can only cover very little in that. And that is up online. It's audio recording, but I'm going to do a brief recap of some important aspects of that, going in to sort of set up tonight's lecture. And then tonight is the History of Humanity 1600 to 1763, which is essentially from the onset of the 17th century through to the conclusion of the 7 Years' War. But I'm adding this additional 15 minutes on the American Revolution, which was really supposed to be covered more in the third lecture, but in this kind of kill 2 birds with 1 stone maneuver, I'm doing it here. So let me just begin with a recap. I know that some people have listened to the earlier one. I know some people haven't. So I'm going to try and split the difference and not bore the people who've heard the first one to death, but also provide enough detail that what I'm going to say about the 17th and first 2/3 of the 18th century makes sense coming out of the earlier lecture. So essentially, Platypus has a very large, large-scale vision of where the previous 200 years of human history fits in the history of the human species as a whole. And that vision goes more or less something like this. Around 10,000 years ago, there was a dramatic shift in human communities from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agriculturalists. That's most commonly referred to as the Neolithic Revolution, in which people moved from being nomadic to settled peasants. Introduced systematic farming, important degrees of division of labor. You see the first rise of urban centers and trade routes. This is commonly referred to as civilization, right? The dawn of civilization somewhere in what is today the Middle East and North Africa. but its multiple emergence over the globe. And with the rise of settled agricultural life, you have the displacement of hunter-gatherer populations. And the displacement of hunter-gatherer populations, rather than any necessary or progressive move in human history, can be seen in many respects as a catastrophe. I mean, there are many progressive elements in the emergence of settled agricultural civilization, but there are also many what might be called catastrophic or regressive elements. Incredible increase in disease that came with animal husbandry, a lessening of life rates, a worse caloric intake, more brutal forms of warfare, etc., etc. Also, class society comes into being with settled agricultural life. That is, it's really the first time in human history with the Neolithic Revolution that you have the rise of a class society. That is, a group of direct producers, mostly working the land, who produce for their own subsistence, their immediate consumption. That's what the peasantry has been historically. And they have a small surplus, which they in turn provide to a class of lordly exploiters. A clerical class, a priestly class, an aristocratic and noble class, who are not directly involved in production, but rather carry out all of the other functions of a complex civilization. Warfare, religion, division of labor, building public infrastructure. You can imagine all of these things. So as of 10,000 years ago, you had this very dramatic shift from hunter-gatherer to settled agricultural life. And it's really for millennia settled agricultural life lasted. And it's only recently in the history of the species that settled agricultural life began to come to an end. For the millennia of settled agricultural life, there were crises, meaning there were recurrent crises that a lot of historians and social scientists now like to refer to as Malthusian crises, meaning essentially that the human population expanded faster than the ability of human agrarian and farming techniques to provide resources necessary to reproduce the population. So the population expanded faster than the resources necessary to reproduce them. Overpopulation set in, and a whole series of factors with overpopulation. Famine, plague, war ensued, and you have these recurring crises of settled agricultural life. Now, what's very unique about Western Europe is medieval Western Europe. So I'm talking roughly Western Europe in between, let's say, 500 and 1500 AD or CE, whichever you prefer. What's very unique about that is it has an absence of what might be called a world empire, meaning generally, if you look, since the Neolithic Revolution, the great zones of settled agriculture have usually had some very complex civilizations, world empires. If you were to look at South Asia, on the eve of European imperialism, the Mughal Empire provides such a world empire. Middle Kingdom Egypt, Pharaonic Egypt, provides such a world empire. Up until the 15th century, much of the Eastern Mediterranean world, settled agricultural life in the Eastern Mediterranean world was ruled by the Byzantine Empire. But really, since the fall of the Western Roman Empire, settled agricultural life on the far western end of the Eurasian continent had no world empire. It instead had, after a very long, and this is a crude summary of the last lecture, a very long period now referred to as Dark Ages. There were attempts to reconstitute the Western Roman Empire, the most famous of which is probably Charlemagne's effort. But quickly after Charlemagne's death, the empire falls apart, and essentially his cavalry settle down into manorial estates with castles and become eventually the feudal nobility. But it's nevertheless the case, if you look at Europe from the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Western Europe, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire up through the 16th and 17th centuries, there's no really universal monarchy or world empire that oversees settled agricultural life. And what happens is that really Western Europe becomes prone, particularly from the 10th century onwards, to very severe Malthusian crises. What I mean by that is what you see is you see a period in which peasants begin cultivating lands, usually highly arable lands. They produce families. Those families then expand northward, southward, eastward. They settle new zones of agrarian production. They have families. They continue to produce at a higher rate, right? They have. It's not a complete Dark Ages, right? I mean, there were some sophisticated agricultural techniques in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries. They're producing some degree of a surplus that allows some family life to expand and to colonize further lands. I mean, colonize here in the sense of peasant families going to uncultivated, uninhabited lands and settling down, right? But what slowly tends to happen over time is that increasingly less arable and less fertile lands come under colonization. And as that happens, the ability of the population to reproduce itself comes up against definite limits, meaning the population is growing and growing, and then what happens is less arable lands are brought under the cultivation, less agrarian resources, foodstuffs, raw materials are produced, and the population is increasingly less able to reproduce itself. And so we see a very clear pattern from the 9th and 10th centuries right through to the 16th and 17th centuries in Western Europe of these Malthusian crises, where the population expands beyond the ability to reproduce itself. And that tends to lead to catastrophe. I'll get into the details of that later on, but essentially after a period of catastrophe, population collapse, warfare, etc., what happens is suddenly, again, part of the population has been decimated, and suddenly you see a slow uptick in European population and prosperity, in infant mortality, these kinds of things, as a sort of basement is reached, a rock bottom is reached in these Malthusian crises. But something very peculiar happens in 14th century Western Europe. In 14th century Western Europe, you have the onset of something that's generally referred to as the crisis of the 14th century. It lasts from roughly 1320 to 1480. And this crisis of the 14th century, initially it's one of these classic Malthusian traps where less and less arable land is being colonized by the peasantry. The peasantry, thus, in response, is less able to reproduce itself, and a period of hunger and famine sets in. And it's in this period of hunger and famine that the plague hits. Now, there's a lot of debate on this, but one theory is that in periods of that the Bubonic Plague, which struck Europe in the 14th century, had probably been brought in before through prior trade routes with the Near East and the Far East. But it was particularly in this period of hunger and famine and malnutrition that the population was most susceptible to the spread of this. Long story short, the Bubonic Plague or the Black Plague or the Black Death, you've heard of this before, hits Europe in the 1340s and begins to decimate the population. In the next several decades, somewhere between 30 and 50% of the population, depending on where you are in Western Europe, gets wiped out. In this same period of famine, plague, population collapse, essentially the aristocratic lordly classes, right, who depend for their own reproduction, their own subsistence, on exploiting, that is, taking a surplus from peasants for which they do not work, right? They begin to suffer declines in their own incomes and their own reproductive capacities. Because think about this, their peasants are producing less, and their peasants are increasingly less willing to pay surpluses to the lords, right? Increasingly less willing to pay out some kind of surplus to the lords. And what happens as a result is you have, in the midst of this crisis of the 14th century, an intense period of peasant-lord warfare, in which peasants break out in revolt and attempt to really resettle the conditions of feudalism. This peasant revolts and jacqueries spread throughout Western Europe, the most famous of which is the Peasant Revolt in England of 1381. Now, these periods of revolt and warfare are largely due to the following reasons. The lords, in the context of declining surpluses, how are the lords going to maintain and increase their income? They're going to want a bigger slice of peasant production, right? Let's say, I'm making this up, it's crude, let's say they're guaranteed 10% of peasant production. But suddenly peasant production is collapsing. That's 10% of a lot less. So suddenly you want to carve out a larger percentage. On the other hand, the peasants are being asked to pay out a larger percentage when their own income, their own resources, are in a rapid state of decline. And this produces massive, massive peasant revolts and lordly repression. And you see this throughout the bloody codes of the 14th and 15th century. The attempts to really repress the peasantry, put them into new forms of bondage, new forms of slavery and servitude, and massive revolts. Now, the key to all of this is I am really projecting backwards categories of the modern world. Nobody thought of it as a contract where I'm getting 10% and you're getting 20%. It's just, I have to summarize. The way you would have to imagine it, though, is when a lord is told by a peasant that he can't meet, not only can he not pay out the higher proportion of his own production to the lord, he can't even pay out the old proportion. Suddenly, what the lord sees is a questioning of the entire caste structure. Feudal Europe is a caste structure. Not really one society, but many, many different societies. The three most of which are important are those who work, those who fight, those who pray. That is, those who fight are the nobility, those who pray are the clerisy, those who work are everyone else. Mostly direct peasant producers in the countryside and a few traders and craftsmen in towns. All right? But this is really a caste system, a great chain of being that has its own hierarchies, its own privileges. If we were to look across feudal Europe, it's not one society, right, in which people are contracting with one another. It's really a whole great chain of being with different schemes, different privileges, different charters. No town is the same as any other town. They all have their own corporate charter and relationship. Every guild has its own rules for reproduction, its own systems. The lords relate to everyone else not as contractors for a surplus, but as masters of men. And so when the peasants refuse not only to pay a higher rate of their production, but aren't even meeting their former rates, the lords view this as a direct assault on their mastery over men, their dominion over other men. That's how this is experienced. And peasants, when lords come to ask for more, experience this as a violation of the great chain of being. That is, although the peasants own servitude above to their lords, whom the divine order has set above them simply to contemplate as beautiful and noble and wonderful objects, those same nobility owe reciprocal duties and obligations to the people below them. That is, being a master over someone isn't just treating someone like total property, like, say, in the antebellum American South, in which African slaves are total property. That's not what a serf or a peasant is. It's not just total private property to be treated as you see fit. It's all bound up in this schema of servitude on above, but obligations and duties are below, right? And what's really important is there isn't like, let's say the Duke of Newcastle. I'm just picking a random aristocrats in the medieval world. Okay, he can never not be the Duke of Newcastle. You could establish his family name. Let's say it's John Pelham. Okay, I'm making that up. But he's never John Pelham. He's always the Duke of Newcastle. He's always a master over men. He's always a lord. It's impossible for him to be otherwise, right? This is not a world of private individuals who go out and perform a public function. Construction worker, doctor, lawyer, mechanic, teacher, right? This is a world in which everyone embodies who they are all the time, whether or not they're a servant or a bondsman or a master of men, a duke, a marquis, or a priest. All right? And their relations within the priestly class, or caste, are very different from those below. And that's why it's really important to think feudal Europe, in other words, is simply one variant of a common pattern of settled agricultural life that has been on this planet for 10,000 years. There's not some earlier European essence that's just been unfolding since the moment the Greeks, Periclean Athens, played out in Ada. That is complete bullshit. Essentially, from ancient Athens to ancient Rome to feudal Europe, these are just variants on settled agricultural life that actually, and these variants have a lot more similarities with other types of settled agricultural life. There's ways in which medieval China and the ancient Roman Empire are much, much more similar than feudal Europe and the Roman Empire. Right? Even though feudal Europe has the goals to restore the Roman Empire, it's nothing like the Roman Empire. But retrospectively, what we can see sitting from the modern world is we can see these are all part of a pattern of settled agricultural life. No one at the time would have said, I live in Christendom and I'm part of settled agricultural civilization. No one would have said that. We retrospectively, living amidst the breakdown of settled agricultural life, can see that for the previous 10,000 years, humanity has largely been organized in these very, very different communities that share at some basic, extremely crude level, settled agricultural civilization. And it's just a rubric, a name, a title for separating them from the hunter-gatherers that went before and the increasingly modern world of capital that exists after them. Now, what happens in the 14th century, and I really have to skip ahead here, is essentially this crisis sets in. And what happens that's very peculiar is the 14th and 15th century could be seen from one perspective as just another recurrent crisis in the medieval world that was just going to bottom out, eliminate large sections of the population, and eventually allow for a reconstitution of Europe in its classic medieval form. But that doesn't happen. What begins to happen because of the depth of the crisis, large zones of northwestern Europe essentially become proletarianized. What do I mean by that? I don't mean that factories of 19th century Manchester emerged in the 14th and 15th century. What I mean is, in certain areas of feudal, settled agricultural European civilization, there is such a breakdown caused by famine, plague, peasant revolts, aristocratic warfare, that what happens is the peasants, some of the peasantry, some of the caste of peasants is able to break away from their servitude. But at the same time, even though they break away from their servitude, they are not able to establish control over their means of subsistence, their means of reproduction. That is, they lose control of the land and the tools they've produced with and farmed with in the medieval period. Right? And nobody intends this to happen. There's a catastrophe, a cataclysm of Western European civilization in the 14th and early 15th centuries that there's no great world empire there to control. It simply is one catastrophe after another. There's no medieval China or Pharaonic Egypt or Mughal Empire or old ancient Western Roman Empire or Byzantine Empire to contain this crisis, and it simply begins to just simply enter into further catastrophe. And what we see emerge is in zones of northwestern Europe with no one intending, in the midst of this peasant and lordly warfare, some peasants in resisting lordly rule in order not to create a new world, but to try and reestablish the old feudal world, they manage to break from their lordly dominion. And they are no longer servants or slaves or bondsmen to a lord. On the other hand, some of them are able to capture control of the land and the tools they had worked with under the lord, and they become small peasant proprietors. But many, many others, particularly in northwestern Europe, really are not even able to do that. They become doubly free, meaning they're free from their slavery and servitude, but they're also free from their ability to reproduce themselves. They are free from servitude, but free to starve. And that's what I mean by proletarianization. That is, what we see is the beginnings, very imperfectly, very chaotically over 2 centuries, in certain sections of northwestern Europe, not as some great emancipation, but rather as a catastrophe of civilization. We see emerge a generalization of the wage labor form in certain areas of northwestern Europe. And what I mean by the wage labor form at this point is not someone walking into an urban manufacturing unit and contracting to work for a set number of hours to receive an abstract money payment. What I mean is literally simply a group of people, a large section of the population, that does not have control of land and tools with which to reproduce themselves, but also does not have, has broken from mastery over them. Now, the problem is, if we look at the law codes, if we look at the statute books of 14th and 15th century Europe, it's an extremely brutal period. Meaning much efforts are undertaken to try and establish feudalism, to deal with, there's a category that arises called masterless men, vagabonds, people who have no place. They're not tied to land anymore. They're not under a master of men. There's this intense breakdown, right? And what begins to happen is in the period of this intense breakdown is what we can begin to see. In other words, we're looking from the old medieval world, pre-14th century, this is a catastrophe. But now going forward, what we can see is roughly in between the years 1300 and about 1600, those 300 years, we can see that what begins to emerge as certain aspects of the commodity form of labor. Now, what I mean by that is we do not yet have bourgeois society, but in the midst of medieval breakdown, we begin to have elements of the commodity form of labor. And I'm going to get into the details of that in a moment. So what does that mean? Well, essentially what begins to happen, right, is that you have the emergence of cities, particularly in places like Renaissance Italy, the Hanseatic League in German-speaking Europe, the Low Countries, England, the southern British Isles. You have the emergence of cities which begin to increasingly see the wage labor form. All right? And that is people coming in from the countryside who work in some type of productive unit in return for a wage, in return for some kind of abstract payment that allows them to go out and buy the things they need. Now, in the 14th and 15th century, and I have to summarize here very quickly, so what you begin to see is the catastrophe of medieval civilization, but the growth out of this proletarianization of significant sectors of the population, of degrees of urbanization and commercialization, that while if they had stopped, simply could be seen as the old urbanization and commercialization that accompanied the restoration of medieval life after catastrophe, but we can retrospectively see what's happening slowly is these forms of urbanization and commercialization are being driven by a new form of social life. That is, the form of social life based on the universal exchange of labor. And the phenomenon that begin to register the emergence of these new urban centers, and what's really important is there were these urban centers that had come in previous agrarian civilizations, but they tended to be swallowed up by the surrounding agrarian civilization. It's really the breakdown of European rural life in the 14th and 15th centuries that provides the context for a kind of mushroom clouding of certain of these urban centers, right, on the basis of wage labor. And what we see is within these urban centers throughout northwestern Europe, the growth of the wage labor form, that is employment for a wage to work in, most importantly, textile industries, and on the same hand, the growth of commercial interdependencies between these market towns, these manufacturing villages, and these commercial port cities. And phenomena that are expressive of this, very broadly speaking, are things like the Renaissance, the Protestant Reformation, and the discovery of the New World. Now, these three phenomena are, and this is really important, I can't go into detail, they were in the first lecture, are really phenomena that are not motivated by something like the conscious attempt to create capitalism or bourgeois society or anything like that. Rather, they're genuinely motivated by attempts to constitute some type of social and political stability in the midst of this incredible chaotic breakdown of European caste society. What do I mean by that? Well, let me sort of give three examples. The Renaissance largely happens, it happens throughout Europe, but of course its greatest crystallization are in these burgeoning city-states of central and northern Italy. Initially, the kind of re-exploration of Latin texts preserved during the medieval period, but after the fall of Byzantium in 1453, a lot of ancient Greek texts begin to flow in with Byzantine intellectuals who are fleeing the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, and who are coming into Western Europe. And what's key is you have for the first time a real growth of the printing press and textuality in these burgeoning cities based on a growing wage labor and commercial interdependency, right? And so, but the Renaissance, right, initially tries to, in the midst of the crisis of medieval civilization, recapture something like the stability of the old world. It's this very Janus-based phenomenon, meaning the Italian Renaissance, if you look at someone like Machiavelli, he believes the most that late medieval Europeans could hope to do is to reconstitute the ancient world, that the best they could do is become the old Romans again, or the ancient Greeks again. But there are people like Alberti, who, writing in the same city, Florence, around the same time period, begin to say, no, we can. The ancients were great, but we can stand on their shoulders. We can go beyond them. So there's this very Janus-based character to the Renaissance, right? This recovery of ancient Latin and Greek texts and learning, right? But it's very bound up with, right, this emerging universal exchange of labor, right? Which I'm not yet calling bourgeois society because it really occupies both worlds. It is the discovery. It's the discovery of these ancient texts, but these texts are both being discovered as a way to do two things: to try and reestablish stability in the middle of late medieval chaos, so one foot in the old world, but also a desperate attempt to try and figure out these new forms of wage labor and commercial life. And the ancient world, with its far higher degrees of urbanization and commercialization than the medieval world, is really the initial intellectual resource for trying to adjudicate, to make one's way in a proto-bourgeois world. Right? The ancient world has much more about urban life, about trading, about exchange, about literacy, right? About republican forms of government, urban communal forms, maritime activity than the feudal rural world did. But so these texts are both an attempt to establish stability in the midst of a late medieval crisis, but also to try and think about what are the possibilities coming out of this crisis for a new world. That's the Renaissance, in a nutshell. The Protestant Reformation largely derives from the fact there had been, in the midst of these catastrophes, and prior in medieval Europe, there had been many heresies, many heresies. But what really allows the Protestant Reformation to set afire, principally Martin Luther's critique of the Catholic Church launched in the early 16th century, what really sets it afire are two phenomena. The growth of these new urban centers, because the Catholic Church had been organized in a period that was largely agrarian and rural. And so its parish and clerical structure is not well adjusted to the growth of these new urban centers and these new commercial and proto-industrial interdependencies. It's not well adjusted. And so there begins to flourish in the 14th and 15th centuries a series of heresies that it has an increasingly difficult time controlling. And in fact tries to found these mobile monastic orders in an attempt to deal with the fact that its rural parish structure cannot deal with these new urban heresies. All right? On the other hand, really crucially, it's also the case the printing press has come out. And it allows for the spread of Luther's critique of the church in the way it would never have been possible to spread before throughout these new urban centers. But again, don't just think of it as technological invention. It's these new urban centers, and they're increasingly literate and debate-based communal forms of people who are not peasants, of people who are not even, urban poor, but are genuinely middling sort craftsmen and merchants and ship captains and shopkeepers beginning to have a kind of public life and discourse beyond the bounds of caste feudal society. Right? And so there's a reason why Gutenberg and a lot of other people are desperately looking for a way to provide manuscript sources in a cheap and efficient fashion, easily reproducible fashion. That's the rule the invention of the printing press comes out of. But when the printing press is invented suddenly, right, you can have a genuine republic of letters, a conversation purely based on text, and not based on, right, the interaction between fundamentally different orders of castes. But rather you have the kind of rudiments of the ability for textuality based on your capacity to exercise a rational persuasion. Again, we're not totally there yet. But what's really, really important is, again, Luther is not attempting to inaugurate, nor are the other Protestant reformers, the modern world, or the world of bourgeois society, or capitalism. Rather, Luther is really, really upset with the Catholic Church's ability to deal with the uncertainty of the 14th and 15th centuries. Right? You've had the Great Schism. The Catholic Church has two popes throughout this period often. You have many heresies emerging. Luther's deeply nervous. And Luther wants a certitude about salvation. And it's his attempt to achieve a certitude of salvation that launches him on this critique of the Roman priesthood, the Roman Catholic priesthood. What we can see retrospectively, though, is that this is essentially a launch on the caste system. He's attacking the clerical caste of agrarian civilization. He is saying there is no mediating caste between the individual's conscience and God, right? But what's really important is he's coming out of this medieval world, right? And he's experiencing this new urban world, these new commercial interdependencies, these new heresies, this printing press world, this rise of translations of the Bible in vernacular, all of these types of elements, right? And he's taking advantage of this world to launch his critique of the Catholic Church. But what's absolutely crucial to realize is that Luther is not some kind of proto-liberal demanding religious toleration. Luther wants the restoration of primitive Christianity. He wants the certitude of primitive Christianity. He is upset with the Catholic Church and the clerical caste's inability to provide that. But his view is not, you can read the Bible directly through the vernacular translation. It's not simply in the holy language of Latin. It can be in vernacular German or vernacular English or vernacular Italian. That's not his view. His view is his reading of the Bible directly is right. All right? That's crucial. He doesn't think he's got one alternative reading and all these reasonable people can simply, sola scriptura, by scripture alone, read the Bible. He thinks he's capturing the truth against the satanic corruption of the medieval church. And he thinks all the other Protestant reformers who disagree with his reading of the Bible are as wrong, as satanic, as lost as the Catholic Church and as anybody who's never seen the light of Christianity. And that's crucial. He does not launch this critique of the clerical state in the name of some kind of proto-liberal religious toleration. He launches this estate to try and create religious stability in the midst of this deep late medieval crisis. But in doing so, he enunciates this critique of the caste system that makes possible many, many different people having access to vernacular translations of the Bible and coming up with, based on their own conscience and their own reading of said Bible, their own interpretations and founding their own churches. But all of these people initially think of themselves essentially as having the truth. And that's really crucial, right? And so what happens is essentially you have the growth of a Reformation, but it's instantly many Reformations. Many Reformed churches grow, and all of them think they have the truth. Now, the third and final thing is the New World, and I'll just cover this extremely clearly. Columbus, of course, famously discovers, right, the West Indies, North America, etc., the Americas. What's really key is Columbus is absolutely, in one respect, discovering these maritime routes, this new markets that will be crucial to creating this world market that's so key for the development of bourgeois society. But the subjectivity that Columbus has in doing this is very much that of the late medieval Christian. That is, he is not sailing in order to discover paths, in order to new maritime routes, new sea routes, new markets. He's doing this because he wants to recapture the Holy Lands from the infidel, from Islam. And the great Khan, the non-Muslim ruler of China, is who he thinks he is sailing to. And he is hoping, he has letters with him for Ferdinand and Isabel to make alliance with the great Khan against Islamic rulers. So this is, again, this late medieval crisis of Christian civilization in which Columbus is going out to discover the great Khan in China, to have an ally against Islam, to capture the Holy Lands. This is motivated totally by a late medieval apocalyptic impulse, and not by the discovery of maritime or commercial routes. It nevertheless has that effect of reinforcing this burgeoning urban world of growing commercial and proto-industrial interdependencies, ultimately based on the spread and reproduction of wage labor as a social form. So what you have then, by the end of this crisis in the 15th and early 16th century, is the discovery of these three new worlds, right? At the same time, the physical new world, North America, the West Indies, South America, the passage around the Cape of Good Hope, around the southern tip of Africa to Asia, the discovery of physical new worlds and new maritime routes, the discovery of an internal new world, that is, the spiritual internal subjectivity of the Protestant Reformation, the destruction of outward forms such as rituals and saints and pilgrimages, and the turn inward to conscience and the relation between individual conscience and God. And the final new world is this old new world, the ancient texts of the Greco-Roman world. And all of these things are an attempt to respond to a late medieval crisis, but at the same time end up reinforcing the development of this burgeoning commercial, urban, proto-industrial world. All right? And so what I want to emphasize so strongly is essentially the bottom-up character of this. It is not coming from some kind of elites, priests, or kings trying to create this new world. Rather, it's coming from a catastrophe, from the transformation of humanity in every aspect of its life. All right? That is a transformation, what it reads, where it lives, how it reproduces itself, what it believes in, where it sails, its conception of history, of time. This is not a kind of economic revolution in which a commercial bourgeoisie, in which merchants and manufacturers are destroying the feudal world in order to assert their commercial and manufacturing interests. This is not a revolt by financiers against feudal lords and kings. Rather, what this is at its heart, all right, is the complete transformation of humanity from the bottom up. And not simply economically. It's a transformation of humanity in philosophy, in religion, in art, in painting, in urban life, in forms of human community, in types of manuscript and textual culture, every possible aspect, right, that has this Janus-based character of the attempt to preserve the old world, but in doing so is also constituting a new one, from the bottom up. Now, at the same time that all of these developments are taking place we're now moved fully into the 16th century. At the same time that these developments have been taking place, you've had the reconstitution of elites in increasingly centralized political formations that we can call territorial states. What I mean by that is, as aristocrats and kings have lost power, that is, have faced peasant revolts, have faced increasingly aristocratic warfare, because remember, in the middle of this catastrophe, aristocrats are also going to war with one another. Because if you can't get as much as you need to out of your current peasants, your best bet of getting more is conquering other people's peasants. It's a zero-sum world. And if your slice of the pie is decreasing, the only way you can recuperate it is to cut out somebody else's slice of the pie. Take it away from them and give it to yourself. All right? And so warfare, there's been a total breakdown. Aristocrats have been fighting. The most famous manifestation of this is the 14th and 15th century 100 Years' War between England and France. Aristocrats have been fighting. Peasants and aristocrats have been fighting. Absolutely crucial and key. But in the context of this, what we can see over time, again, their mentality is to preserve their mastery over men, their dominion, their caste status. It's not to create a new world, but aristocrats and kings are regrouping in ever larger politico-military bodies in order to be able to exercise more force with which to repress peasants and with which to preserve their mastery over men, and to control larger territories from which to extract larger surpluses with which to reproduce themselves. And so what we see by the 16th century is we see former local feudal sovereignties giving way to increasingly centralized territorial kingdoms, in which what you have is a feudal nobility that's really no longer a local lord in a region, but is now instead something like a courtier, a member of a king's court, and the king has absolute sovereignty. And what the king has control over is a vast bureaucracy and a vast standing army with which it can coerce large territories of peasants, get the surpluses it can no longer get on an individual basis, and then use those surpluses to reproduce the court, to reproduce the monarchy. But what's key is clerics, aristocrats, monarchs are not pursuing these increasingly centralized states with ever larger bureaucracies and armies in order to create the modern state, but rather it's a kind of top-down response to this bottom-up transformation of society in the midst of catastrophe. And so you have the rise of these old regimes. Now what's key is these old regimes, though, however, are largely in competition with one another. That is to say, with respect to one another, these increasingly centralized royal absolute estates that we see come into being in the 15th and 16th century, right? Their bureaucracies are and internal standing armies are designed to coerce their internal peasant population, but also to project power abroad, to conquer more territories, to have more peasants. But the way these states operate is not modern interstate relationships. Rather, it's about you need more resources, ergo you have to conquer more land. It's a zero-sum world of land, right? The less land you have, the more peasants you have to extract from, the more resources you have available. We're not living in a world of industrial economic productivity, right? And so these states are both designed to coerce their internal peasant populations, but also to fight one another. And you have, with the growth of these states and their centralized bureaucracies, their centralized tax-gathering devices, their centralized armies, you have the growth of warfare. Increasingly, warfare is involved between bigger and bigger states. What do you need? You need larger supply lines to move material and men throughout Europe. Wars last much, much longer than they've ever lasted before. On top of all of this, and crucially, you need ever more complicated tax structures to get these revenues from your locality. So you have to intervene ever more in the locality. The centralized monarchical state has to intervene ever more in the locality in order to participate in this growing warfare between these centralized monarchical states. What essentially also happens with the growth of the Protestant Reformation is you have the wars of religion in the 16th century. That is, suddenly these competing universalisms, Catholicism, Lutheranism, Calvinism, what have you, get layered on to this warfare between royal absolutist states. And the growth of this immense warfare, both in terms of fiscal and military needs, but also in terms of the size of states, and the universal religious crusader mentality underlying a lot of these wars, really you experience the 16th and 17th century as a period of massive, massive warfare. And really this culminates in the 30 Years' War, which lasts from 1618 to 1648. And it is in the 30 Years' War where, crucially, you really begin to see a shift. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But that war starts out with these increasingly large royal absolute states lining up against one another, Catholic versus Protestant, right? That is places like Bavaria and Spain being concerned about turning back the tide of the Protestant Reformation, and places like Sweden and Protestant northern German principalities being concerned about re-Catholicization, wanting to spread Protestantism. And so if you look at the way great European monarchies enter that war at the beginning, the 30 Years' War, what essentially you see is the warfare very much driven by religious goals. But in the midst of this total European war being fought out across the continent, requiring fiscal and military resources that no one has ever seen before, you begin to have the breakdown of states throughout Western Europe. You have the Fronde in France, a revolt of aristocrats and to some degree peasants. You have the revolt of the aristocratic Cortes in Spain against the Hobsbawm monarchy. You have revolts throughout Europe because what's happening is these states engaged in ever larger warfare on an ever larger scale that require ever greater armies, ever greater bureaucracies, ever more taxes are beginning to collapse socially. And what we begin to see in the midst of this warfare is a shift from war of religion to raison d'etat, reason of state. That is to say, you begin to see a new ideology of geopolitics emerge where the state sees its own interests as the basis for its internal and foreign pursuits. All right? That is increasingly but at this level, it's still understood as a dynast or a family, a dynastic family. But what you have by 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia, which ends the 30 Years' War that had stricken Europe from 1618, what you have in the Treaty of Westphalia is the rise of a multi-state system between European old regimes. That is, these absolute monarchical states essentially have abandoned their wars of religion, crusader ideologies, and have begun to emphasize raison d'etat, that is, the needs of state, the reason of state itself. The dynast, the king's need to have social order at home and to maintain a balance of power abroad so as not to lead to state collapse. But again, this is all being achieved for the idea of preserving the dynast. The territory is still understood broadly. We're in the world of the old regime of a dynasty. So if we were to stop in the world of 1648, we would have these vast old regimes. Oh, the one thing I left out very quickly is that the other thing the Treaty of Westphalia does in ending the wars of religion and giving rise to raison d'etat is essentially says rulers can pick whatever religion they want, and they'll be respected. Meaning, if I'm a Lutheran prince in a small German principality, let's say, and I decide I want Lutheranism, everybody inside my principality has to be Lutheran, but no one outside will anymore attempt to launch crusading wars to convert my realm to Calvinism or Catholicism. Again, Treaty of Westphalia is not liberalism, right? It's about reinforcing the old regime dynastic world. This interstate system, right, based on raison d'etat, based on a balance of power now with old regimes playing one another off. Now, what's really important here is, if I were to end the story here, basically, as of 1648, the multi-state Westphalian-based European world of the old regime would not be a significant departure from traditional agrarian civilization. But there are really two things I've left out of this story that are key. The first of them is this. In their growing warfare over the 16th and 17th century, in their growing warfare throughout the 16th and 17th century, these increasingly large royal states, in competition with one another, and in their attempt to preserve their dynastic interests and social order at home, have been reinforcing and drawing on this growing proto-bourgeois world, this growing world of proto-industrial and commercial and urban life and interdependencies. Examples of this: many of these old regime states are sponsoring ship captains and explorers to find new trade routes. All right? But this is not being done in the name of some kind of modern market mentality. It's being done in the name of more revenues to the dynast, so he or she can preserve his family on the throne at home and keep his great power status amongst his brother and sister, and they all are brother and sisters to one degree or another, monarchs of Europe. Right? And that's key. But we see suddenly they're destroying customs barriers. But they're not destroying customs barriers because they have political economic advisors telling them about the knock-on effects of free trade. They're destroying customs barriers because their view is these growing commercial dependencies are sites of wealth generation that they can tax and control and draw from. All right? So what's really key here is in their competition with one another, these monarchical states are reinforcing the bourgeois world. But it's reinforcing the bourgeois world in order to preserve the old world. And this is really crucial. This is why Marx and Engels say that the old regime is a state that emerges out of the balance between the nobility, the feudal nobility, and the commercial bourgeoisie. The reason why Marx and Engels say that, crucially, is not because they were talking about some vulgar reading in which the state is able to rise above classes when they're balanced against one another. It's because the old regime is genuinely something that is a product of the breakdown of settled agricultural life, and it has one foot in the old world, trying to preserve a single religious monopoly, trying to preserve a single dynasty on the throne, trying to preserve an aristocratic caste system through stronger state structures, bureaucracy, and standing army. But at the same time, has its foot in this new world, this world coming out of this catastrophe, right? It has its foot in this proto-bourgeois world. It wants more maritime exploration. It wants more trade so as to have more revenues for the dynast to spend to preserve the aristocratic caste, to preserve social order at home, to be engaged in geopolitical warfare abroad. It wants to spread textuality, the new forms of textuality coming out of the Renaissance and Reformation, because it wants better and more educated bureaucrats who can extract more wealth and can understand more about the locality. So it's creating this class of educated bureaucrats beyond the nobility. So it genuinely is this Janus-faced world where it really is looking backwards to an attempt to recover the lost world of the 12th century, but it also is looking forward, right, to the worlds of the 18th and 19th century at the same time. And that's what Marx and Engels meant, that the old regime comes out of the balance of class forces between the bourgeoisie and the feudal nobility. They did not mean it comes because the king cleverly figures out how to get the urban traders and the rural lords to fight one another and thus allow himself freedom of movement, freedom of action. Right? This is an epochal sense in which Marx and Engels mean that the old regime is the balance of the nobility of the bourgeoisie. What they mean is the social power of the old world and the social power of the new world are both present. And the old regime has the wolf by the ears. It's trying to hold on to the new world, even more than the wolf by the ears, right? It's riding this wolf. It's growing more wolves with the idea of constantly trying to preserve itself, all right? Now, that would still not be enough. That if we ended the story there, that would still not be enough. But there is a thunderbolt which happens. Even these old regime reinforcing bourgeois society, even if we ended the story in 1648, we would still have to tell something along the lines of, well, this is just settled agricultural life with far more maritime, commercial, and urban activity than ever before. So what causes the shift? So I'm sorry I don't have the chart when I do these lectures in New York. I sort of a chart behind me. What you would see is the period of 1300 to 1600 would be characterized as the breakdown of medieval civilization, but also simultaneously as the emergence of what we can retrospectively call aspects of the commodity form of labor. But it would only be 1600 to 1800, all right, that would genuinely be seen as the emergence of bourgeois society. That's crucial. What I mean by that is this. Retrospectively, we can say that bourgeois society, okay, to be politically constituted through bourgeois revolutions, it was necessary that traditional agrarian civilization broke down a certain region of the globe and that aspects of the commodity form of labor came into being. But absent bourgeois revolution, which is nothing less than the universalization and generalization of the commodity form of labor within a given territory, indeed within a region of the world, there would not be emergent bourgeois society. And so now we can begin to tell the story of 1600 to 1800 as the period of the emergence of bourgeois society. And the reason why we can do that, the reason why we can begin to do that above all else, is because when the Treaty of Westphalia is being signed in 1648, it contains within it something called the Treaty of Munster. The Treaty of Munster is a side treaty that has been made between one of the great powers of late medieval and old regime Europe, Habsburg Spain, perhaps the greatest power of the 16th and early 17th century, and 7 of its principalities that have been in revolt. That is, the United Provinces of the Netherlands. And the reason why we can speak of a fundamentally new epoch in human affairs, or at least the possibility of a new epoch in human affairs, is because of something called the Dutch Revolt, which was concluded with the Treaty of Munster being rolled into the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, but which stretched back all the way to 1568. All the way to 1568. The Dutch Revolt was an 80-year process, often referred to as the 80 Years' War or the Dutch Revolt. Now, what was that about? Well, what it was about is essentially this. You have to think that late medieval Europe is a patchwork of dynasties. It's not the normal unified nation states we experience today, right? The Habsburg kings essentially inherit sections of the Holy Roman Empire. They inherit what's known as Habsburg Austria. They inherit much of the Iberian Peninsula, Habsburg Spain. They inherit all of these new lands discovered in North America and South America. And they inherit these principalities in the Low Countries referred to as the Spanish Netherlands. 18 provinces of the Spanish Netherlands they inherit. Now, what's happening? Well, in the 16th century, the old regime's attempt to preserve the old world, to recreate caste society, to reconsolidate aristocratic and monarchical rule at the level of these royal absolute estates, and to dominate the peasants with large-scale standing armies of bureaucracies rather than just simply local lordly armies and retainers. That world, we can see, is attempting to reinforce the commercial maritime world of proto-bourgeois society, but it's also set on a collision course with it. And that collision course breaks out in between 1568 and 1572 in the Spanish Netherlands. Why is that the case? Because the Spanish Netherlands, above all the northern provinces of the Spanish Netherlands, are the region one of the regions in northwestern Europe that most deeply experienced the crisis of the 14th and 15th centuries. That is, they're the regions, okay, where, remember I talked about proletarianization, the spread of the wage labor form, right? If you look at the Low Countries, the wage labor form spreads in comparison to the rest of Europe, with the exception perhaps of southern England. It's most generalized there. And so proto-bourgeois forms of you'll forgive this, sorry, it's an ugly term, but there's nothing else better for it. Proto-bourgeois forms of urbanization, commercialization, and proto-industrial manufacturing really have their most rapid emergence and consolidation in the Low Countries. All right? And at first, the Habsburg monarchy is trying, essentially, to reinforce this development in order to draw the revenues it wants to keep to pursue its own dynastic feudal interests. All right? What essentially happens is Charles II, who's a great Habsburg monarch of the early mid-16th century, attempts to create a universal monarchy. That is, he has dominion stretching from Austria and Spain to Northern Europe to the New World. And he thinks he can create a universal monarchy and restore Western Europe. And what we can say retrospectively is he thinks he can create a world empire over European settled agricultural life. His failure to do that leads him into despondency, and he breaks his kingdoms down differently. And he gives one to his son, Philip II, who becomes the Habsburg monarch of Spain. And with it, he acquires the Spanish Netherlands. And what Philip II essentially tries to do is become involved in building this old regime Spanish state into an even more powerful bloc than it had been before. And he's very worried because he looks at these distant provinces of his. And remember, he doesn't think I have Spain and then these provinces. He views a province like Aragon or a province like Castile just as a province like Holland. They're just provinces to him that are all under his feudal dynastic lineage. He doesn't think of one as Spanish and one as Dutch or Belgian or something like this. He just thinks of them as all these provinces together to milk and do with as he sees fit. Right? And essentially, he learns that in these 18 provinces that have been so deeply proletarianized, so deeply urbanized, so deeply commercialized, that Calvinism and other forms of Protestantism have really spread far and wide. And furthermore, that the evasion of taxes has really spread far and wide. And so he attempts, in his own great power political interests, to re-Catholicize the Netherlands and to create much stronger tax structures. So imagine, he's trying to project a stronger great power status amongst the old regimes. He needs stronger intervention into the Netherlands to grab onto all this commercial wealth that he sees evading taxes. And this really ignites the Dutch Revolt. This is what gets off between 1568 and 1572. All right? And what we initially see is this revolt takes the form of an extreme Calvinist Protestant Christianity. All right? But over time, particularly by the early 17th century, particularly during a truce, so there's the Dutch Revolt starts in 1568, and then there's an 80 years war between Netherlands and Spain, which has some periods of truce, the longest of which lasts from 1609 to 1621. And it's in that period of truce where we begin to see this kind of golden age Dutch Republic emerge, which is no longer driven by extreme Calvinism or Protestant Christianity, but rather begins to driven by a subjectivity rooted in commercial society, in political economy, in the maximization of wealth, in religious toleration. And so by the early 17th century, the Dutch they've been experiencing these new forms of urban, commercial, proto-industrial emancipation. And that's what's really got to be understood. The freedom from traditional agrarian society, the release from caste society, is a slave revolt of emancipation. And it's in the Netherlands and the Low Countries where this emancipation is felt most strongly. And it's in this region that really throws up by the early 17th century a revolutionary impulse that essentially is responsible for the first bourgeois revolution in world history. All right? And it inaugurates a bourgeois revolutionary epoch that has not ended to this day. That is, the revolt of the Dutch burghers against Philip II in 1568 continues to today. It's been happening in the Arab world. That is, every revolution in capitalist modernity has started as a bourgeois democratic revolution. And that's what the Dutch Revolt becomes, this bourgeois democratic revolution. The reason why it becomes this bourgeois democratic revolution, and this is really important, is that it's not that the bourgeoisie has been plotting in the Netherlands this revolt against Spain. Rather, quite the opposite. The revolt really is led mostly initially by plebeian and genuine middling sort proto-middle class elements. Right? Generally, it's led by the Third Estate. Bourgeois revolutions are not led by the bourgeoisie, they tend to create the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie tends to be a symptom of the success of the bourgeois revolution. And it's really the Third Estate in the Netherlands, in the Low Countries. It's really plebeian groups, domestic servants, wage laborers, small shopkeepers, craftsmen, artisans, journeymen, with some middling sort and wealthier types, merchants, petty manufacturers, wealthier shopkeepers, that launch this assault on the Spanish crown. And that become the key figures in the Dutch Revolt. And it's their drive, right, as the Third Estate, as those who work, that absolutely refuse to submit to re-Catholicization and to the Spanish crown, which they see as the attempt of the First and Second Estates of the medieval feudal world to reassert control over this increasingly emancipated Third Estate. And it's in the midst of that revolt of the Third Estate, in between roughly 1568 and 1609, which you have the transition from a revolt based in Protestant Christianity to really a revolt that becomes self-consciously about commercial society, about religious toleration, about increasing maritime and scientific exploration, about a radical bourgeois impulse, if you will. Okay? And the Dutch Revolt, what's very interesting is during the period of truce between Spain and the Netherlands, between 1609 and 1621, you can really see the two logics that these revolting Dutch provinces, these 7 northern provinces that will become the future United Provinces. You can see the different logic they operate on socially and politically than Spain. Why? Because everybody knows when the truce is signed in 1609 that they're simply gathering their wounds to go back to fight one another. Everybody knows that. What is Spain doing? Spain's building land resources. Spain's preparing to conquer. What is the Netherlands doing? It's discovering new markets. It's sending out maritime explorers. It's massively pursuing scientific discovery. The idea being is it can so-called slip the dikes, meaning it can allow the water to run over the Netherlands. It's below sea level. Much of the present-day Netherlands is below sea level. It can blow open dams, and as these Spanish and imperial armies attempt to come in, it can simply thrust them back, no matter how big these armies is, with the slitting of the dikes, with the opening of the dams. But how does it afford to survive? It's doing all this maritime exploration. It's creating this world market from which it's drawing revenues that no one has ever seen. And so this tiny little republic, these tiny little 7 provinces, mostly below sea level, all right? These tiny little 7 provinces essentially spend so much of the 80 Years' War doing scientific and maritime and commercial exploration and discovery in order to be able to generate wealth from market transactions and contractual exchange, right? Whereas the Spanish are desperately trying to think about alliances with landed powers on the continent, building larger standing armies that require military conquest, ever larger conquest and dominion over men. And so it's really this Dutch revolt, right, that is the first bourgeois revolution in world history. And I want to sort of emphasize essentially that this Dutch revolt, what's so important about it is it keeps this Spanish power at bay. It prevents Philip II Spain and his successors from pursuing a universal monarchy, from pursuing the attempt to create a world empire around late medieval Europe. And with the massive resources it's harnessing from maritime exploration, from colonization of the New World in Asia, from commercial market exchange across the globe, from scientific discovery, from urban proto-industrial and commercial life, it is able to hold at bay this much larger, much more populated, massive land empire of the Spanish crown. And it's able to hold it at bay. Now, why is that important? The reason why that's important is because the failure of Spanish universal monarchy, right, means essentially that the old regime Westphalian interstate order is going to be preserved. Nobody is going to be power enough to destroy the balance of power and to try and create a world empire. And all of the old regimes are going to be of a certain middle to maybe large size, but none of them enough to create a serious world empire. And it's that Dutch Revolt that really lays that out, that holds the Spanish at bay. Now, for much of the rest of the 17th century, once the Treaty of Westphalia is signed, the Dutch are engaged in a war with France, meaning the French, particularly the Bourbons under Louis XIII and Louis XIV, begin to pick up the Spanish project of universal monarchy, begin to try and use their highly populated and very territorially large old regime, centered in Paris and Versailles, to create a world empire, to reestablish the Western Roman Empire, to create a universal monarchy over agricultural Europe. Right? But there's a huge problem now. You have this interstate Westphalian order, this balance of power in which powers are keeping one another at bay. And this has allowed for this radical Dutch revolt to take place, which in turn is introducing for the first time this bourgeois republic into the affairs of old regime states, into the interstate system. And this bourgeois republic, this tiny little, not very fertile piece of land, right, is accumulating treasures and wealth that is simply heretofore unseen in Western Europe. Now, meanwhile, what's been going on in England at the same time during the 17th century, okay, is that essentially you have had, all right, as deep a level, even deeper level of proletarianization, particularly in southern England, than you did in the Low Countries. Meaning, people have been divorced from the land, but they've also been, peasants have been divorced from the land, but they've also been divorced from their means of production and means of subsistence. Which means this process that we saw in the Low Countries, that we saw in places like Renaissance Italy, is even further apace of the dissolution of traditional agrarian life and the rise of aspects of the commodity form of labor, the rise of urbanization, commercialization, and proto-industrialization to a level you haven't seen. In fact, by the second half of the 17th century, 40% of the English population is not primarily employed in agriculture, which is the highest percentage of human life for 10,000 years that had not been employed in agriculture. That is, England by the mid to late 17th century, 40% are not primarily employed in agriculture. That's the highest it had ever been. For much of humanity for 10,000 years, you maybe at best had 5 to 10%. And you have 40% of this society not primarily employed in agriculture. Proletarianization, de-peasantization, the rise of direct producers who are free from the means of subsistence, but are also free from slavery and serfdom, has extended even further. In the context of that, the extension of that form of proletarianization, what's happened, again, think of it this way, you have to really think of it this way, is this is a transformation from the bottom up. The mass of humanity has experienced this catastrophe. All right? It's not some project down of the bourgeoisie. The mass of humanity has experienced this catastrophe. And therefore, all levels of English social life are changing. Peasants are increasingly becoming they're either increasingly going into towns and working for wage labor, or they're being hired back as agrarian wage laborers on commercial farms. So they're becoming wage laborers in the countryside or in these rising towns and cities. Furthermore, the new cities are arising from this breakdown of feudal agricultural life. Cities that are not based on medieval guilds and crafts, but rather are based on the free wage labor form, and that allow for levels of specialization and an extension of division of labor that no one has ever seen before, and really a much deeper level of urban commercialization and proto-industrialization. Beyond that, okay, what's really crucial is these great aristocratic lords and these great gentlemen who own land. They have no longer able to coerce serfs. That is, the English peasantry by the 14th and 15th centuries completely ended serfdom. Now, the English peasantry has not been able to acquire control over land and their tools, but they've ended serfdom. So what happens is the great aristocratic lords have control over their lands and their tools, but they don't have anybody to work with them. So what you see slowly begin to bubble up in the English countryside over the course of the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries is English lords rent their land because, remember, they want to live without working. All right, but they don't have any peasants to course anymore. There's no more serfdom or slavery, but they have land and tools. And they begin to rent their land to commercial tenant farmers who in turn employ agrarian wage laborers. Okay? And you begin to see the emergence of capitalist agriculture by the 16th century in England. Meaning, not only is the direct producer no longer a serf, directly tied to the land with a master of men over him, he is now a wage laborer, contracting to work the land to a tenant farmer. That tenant farmer is also not tied to the land. He's renting it from the aristocrat or the gentleman who rents it to him, and he's in turn investing in the land to produce for the market and to use a large portion of the profit from that to reinvest in the land and to continue production in the market. And what's key is even the aristocrats, the most backward feudal elements of society, have been converted from people who take rents through their caste-based mastery over men to people who take rents in the market. They rent their land to commercial tenant farmers. And the better the commercial tenant farmer, the more he can produce successfully with the market, the higher rent he can afford to pay for the aristocrats. And so slowly, by the early 17th century, you see a genuinely bourgeois subjectivity emerge among English aristocrats and gentlemen. By bourgeois subjectivity here, I really must emphasize, I do not mean they become bourgeoisie in the sense they become merchants, although that's certainly an aspect of it, because they are renting their land on the basis of commercial leases. They're not coercing people that they have mastery over to work for them. They're renting their land to the tenant farmer they think can pay them the highest rent, well, that actually offers them the highest rent. And over time, this rural aristocratic class begins to think of itself in terms of contract, exchange, commercialism, and it begins to evaluate itself and its in social power not on the basis of its family tree or the pictures on its shield, but rather on the amount of money in its pocket. And that's really vital. So by the 17th century, you have, again, basically a capitalist landlord class. But it's not the capitalist landlord class that's been driving, or the merchants and the manufacturers in the town that has been driving the rise of bourgeois society. Rather, it's the breakdown of traditional agrarian life that has been giving rise to a catastrophe which has led to proletarianization, which is transforming humanity in its length and breadth. And the rise of merchants and manufacturers and capitalist landlords is not the motor of this process, it's a symptom. In other words, if one were to speak of this as a disease, it would be proletarianization, the generalization of the wage labor form, and the transformation of humanity in its length and breadth as consumers and producers that is leading to the rise of merchants, manufacturers, and capitalist landlords. All right? What's happened in places like the cities of Renaissance Italy, but above all in the Dutch Republic, but even more so, above all in the Dutch Republic in England, is the age-old traditional link between production and consumption has been broken. All right? And people are beginning to produce, not for their own consumption, but rather to produce to get the means, the abstract money payment, with which to be able to acquire the products of others. All right? And that age-old link has been broken, and you begin to see the emergence of the aspects of the commodity form of labor. And that is experienced, okay, by everyone as emancipatory, right? Because whatever you think about the fact that sure, there was a brutal feudal process where the peasant was expropriated from his land, but there's something extremely emancipatory about the wage laborer able to leave his wage contract and go and work elsewhere. Okay, it's a society by our standards of little mobility. By the early 17th century, it's world historic levels of mobility, of transformation, and of change. And this is absolutely, really crucial to its core. All right. Now, what begins to happen, all right, is, now, flashback to mid-17th century Europe, right? The Stuart Monarchy, so England is, under the Tudors, forming an old regime in the late 15th and 16th century. Just like any other European society, the aristocrats, the monarch, are in some degree, the monarch is trying to preserve himself by creating an old regime absolutist monarchy. the people, the famous Tudors, right? Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth. They're trying to create an old regime, absolute monarchy designed to stave off the crisis of agrarian civilization. But in doing so, they're reinforcing the emergence of aspects of the commodity form. Elizabeth funds a lot of people to go off and explore new sea routes, new commercial trade routes. She doesn't do this in the name of basically giving rise to social emancipation and bourgeois life. She gives this in the name of trying to create more revenues, to have an ever more powerful standing army and bureaucracy with which to make sure she, as a dynast, as a reproducer of a royal lineage and family, and as God's anointed, remains in her place on the great chain of being. But nevertheless, she's doing this. All right? And what's happening is, by this middle of the 17th century, the Stuarts, just like their fellow European sister and brother royal absolutists, are attempting to construct their own absolutist monarchy. All right? They have a problem, though. They have a really big problem, which is, because of the peculiarity of late medieval English developments, the British monarchs cannot get taxes on the land unless Parliament approves those taxes. Meaning, what the British monarch essentially has to do is he has to go to the House of Commons and the House of Lords and request land taxes be levied by the gentlemen and the nobility on their own land. Right? Do people sort of get that? In other words, the aristocrats and the gentlemen, the monarch comes, they have a conversation, the monarch says, I want to do this, this, and that, and there's an agreement, and they levy taxes on themselves, and they give it to the monarch to pursue the project the monarch desires to pursue. The Stuarts begin to want to have independence of Parliament. And if you look in Europe, in the rest of Europe in the 16th, 17th centuries, what's really key is all of the old feudal bodies that the nobility had to express themselves have gone out of existence, right? It's from 1614 to 1789, the Estates General in France is never called, meaning the king has no effective noble or aristocratic or clerical check on the exercise of his sovereign power. It's a genuinely absolutist monarchy. The Stuarts would like this too. They would like not to have to call Parliament. They've got this annoyance. They have to call Parliament because Parliament has the land taxes they need to be able to pursue the projects they want to. So they decide, all right, to sit the 30 Years' War out between 1618 and 1648. The Stuarts, by the way, in this period are they're the Stuarts. After Elizabeth dies, she has no heir. So her cousin in Scotland comes down, James I. And James I and Charles I want to pursue the project of creating a royal despotism that the Tudors were pursuing, but they're really nervous about entering into the 30 Years' War, because they're deeply, deeply, deeply afraid of the fact that it's triggering this state collapse everywhere. And in the midst of this state collapse, they're going to have to request more money from their Parliament. And if they request more money from the Parliament will make them agree to limits on their royal power. So what the Stuarts decide to do in the early to mid-17th century is to begin to intervene in this burgeoning urban and commercial world. This world of London, this world of these growing commercial port cities and manufacturing towns, this world that has been coming out of proletarianization and the transformation of humanity from the bottom up. And the Stuarts began to intervene in this world by levying arbitrary taxes on industry and commerce. And they're levying these taxes on industry and commerce because there's no laws preventing them from doing it. Parliament can't stop them from doing it. But on the other hand, Parliament, Parliament can't stop them from doing it. Sorry. And what's the point of all of this? Well, the point of all of this is essentially this is going to ignite the English Civil Wars of the 1640s. Why is this going to ignite the English Civil Wars? Is because essentially the English landlords are now essentially linked into these proto-bourgeois commercial interdependencies. Furthermore, they're viewing the collapse of their parliamentary power because the Stuarts are trying to get money from commerce and manufacturing rather than from the land, so they don't have to call Parliament. At the same time, manufacturers, traders, plebeians are generally pissed off at this arbitrary taxation from the Stuarts. And these capitalist landlords and these middling sort plebeians in the cities are linked together in this growing proto-bourgeois commercial interdependencies. The lords sitting in the House of Lords and the plebeians sitting on the streets of London all have an interest in this interdependent world in which no one produces for their own consumption, but rather produce to gain the means to acquire the products of others. They're all bound up in that world. Their private reproduction has become a matter of public interdependencies of public life. And when the Stuarts began to arbitrarily interfere in that to build their monarchy, that really creates a lot of social resistance. And the Stuarts are attempting to tax manufacturers and trade and to levy arbitrary taxes in order to essentially create a standing army and bureaucracy that will allow them to rule not only without reference to the people, but without reference to Parliament. And over the course of the 1630s and the early 1640s, Charles I, the second Stuart king of England and Scotland, is on the way to creating an absolutist royal monarchy. The reason ultimately why this is prevented is an alliance of capitalist landlords sitting in Parliament, of capitalist aristocrats and landlords, of proto-bourgeois, proto-capitalist aristocrats and landlords sitting in Parliament, and merchants and manufacturers in the towns, essentially decides that the only way to stop the Stuarts from, who had this growing standing army, in other words, the Stuarts have the means of violence, the monopoly of the means of violence. They're the only ones. Feudalism is ended. English lords don't have a piece of the state or a piece of the military in their locality anymore. All of the military and bureaucratic resources are concentrated in the monarchy. They do not have the means of violence. And so their only option really is to turn, if you'll forgive the phrase, to the London masses and to the urban masses in an attempt to raise an army to counter the Stuarts' burgeoning army. And it's this in the 1640s that gives rise to the English Civil Wars. And it's this extremely dynamic process where an alliance of proto-bourgeois landlords and merchants and manufacturers essentially link up to mobilize urban plebeians and rural yeomen in a new model army, a increasingly rationalized, disciplined model army to try and stave off the Stuart attempt to create a royal despotism. And in this process, and this is vital, it is the rural yeomen and the urban plebeians that drive this revolt. In other words, the English Civil Wars, which blows open the English Revolution, is not driven in its length and breadth by aristocrats and merchants. Although they open it up by trying to resist the monarch, by beginning to politicize and mobilize elements of the London and provincial urban masses, although they're responsible for that initial phase, the way that the proto-bourgeois landlords and merchants and manufacturers think of this is essentially along these lines. Hey, we've got resources in Parliament and our town councils that limit the king. But the king is building this royal despotism that is essentially going to allow him to rule without any reference to our local corporate privileges and aristocratic privileges. We have to find an alternative to this standing army. We will build our own army in the streets of London, the provincial urban centers. But this process, immediately after this happens, right? Because remember, these plebeians have been experiencing the same form of social emancipation. They've been increasingly bound up in these contracts and exchanges, this world in which people freed from extra economic coercion, people contract with one another as independent individuals and they exchange equal values of their own possession. And the concepts of liberty and equality are not limited to the proto-bourgeois landlords and merchants and manufacturers. Everyone is experiencing this growing world of liberty and equality, of the exchange between independent individuals of values, of equal values of their own possession, which is the real productive grounds, as Marx famously said in the Bourgeois, of all concepts, Enlightenment concepts of liberty, equality, that is, I'm going to say early Enlightenment concepts, 17th century Enlightenment concepts. Now, very, very important. Once you have this deep politicization, the civil wars immediately get out of the hand of the elites that have been driving them. And many elements of the commercial landlord class, of the commercial aristocrats and gentlemen, begin to leave the coalition against royal absolutism and join the monarch. And so what you actually see in the English Civil Wars of the 1640s is a process driven above all by urban plebeians, rural yeomen, and urban and rural middling sorts, commercial farmers, shopkeepers, petty manufacturers, not the elite capitalist landlords, but rather genuinely plebeians and middling sorts. And it's an extremely radical process. It increasingly grows more and more radical, where more and more radical claims are made, such that by the late 1640s, it's no longer the case that people simply want to preserve parliamentary and corporate town privileges. People are now saying, we want parliamentary sovereignty. We want sovereignty not to lie in the king, and he has to go advise and consent with Parliament. We want sovereignty to lie in the Parliament. And above and beyond sovereignty lying in the Parliament, and this is really crucial, Parliament is simply a means to an end, which is popular sovereignty. So by the late 1640s, urban, plebeian, and middling sorts, rural yeomen and commercial farmers have overtaken the English Civil Wars, had, through their own self-activity, constructed an alternative state apparatus, an alternative army, based on parliamentary sovereignty, which is vaguely understood as being a means towards an end of popular sovereignty. And in 1648 and 1649, in between December of 1648 and January of 1649, they do the following. They try and execute Charles I. On January 30th, I believe, 1649, Charles I is killed. This is the first time that in European agricultural life, in the midst of this breakdown of all of this, that you have something like the explicit trial of a former sovereign power from the perspective of a new sovereign power. And there is contained in this some notion that society, or some more broad general will, definitely being expressed in terms of a Puritan Calvinist Christianity, but some greater social body, some general will, has come into being to try this criminal against it. That is, the king is not being tried as a feudal peasant revolt. Feudal peasants killed their aristocrats and sometimes killed kings, but they did it because they said these people violated the terms of our slavery. Peasants revolted because they wanted to be re-enslaved under slightly better conditions. These people have revolted in the name, right? In the name of a Calvinist Protestant Christianity that nevertheless is understood to be bound up with some social dynamic, some general will that is shared amongst all the individuals in society and in society more general. And it's really that case. Charles I is tried as a criminal against English society. And that's really, really important. Right? And all of his crimes, he's a secret Catholic, which is true. And he's been trying arbitrary taxes. Right? They lay out an explicit justification of a kind of new social order to try someone who so clearly never operated along those principles. He was obviously bound up with the old regime. All right? And then they proceed to abolish the House of Lords, and they abolish the Church of England. And for the only time in its history, from 1648 to 1653, England is a republic. Only 5 years in its entire history of its existence from whenever you want to date it, medieval Anglo-Saxon communes or the Norman invasion of 1066, there's only been 5 years in English history when it's been a republic. And it was a bourgeois democratic republic. It was known as the Commonwealth. All right? And really, this even much more radical form. The Dutch, and this is really key, the Dutch revolted from the Netherlands and created independence. But England has not revolted from a distant monarch. It has tried its own monarch in the name of a new social principle. This is really, really key. Okay? And it has become a commonwealth. And it's in this period, really in between 1648 and 1653, that England begins to explode with new forms of radicalism at home. There are movements for divorce becomes a movement. There's a strong social movement for divorce. There are even more radical forms of Christianity emerge. There's a primitive communism. There's an attempt to disestablish private property and to share all property in common. There's incredible radicalism. The Dutch doesn't want to make Parliament representative of the people in symbolic language, but actually wants to give every man, every adult male the vote. Universal suffrage is enunciated as a principle of the polity. It's not established, but there's radical movements that merge up and demand this. Wives demand greater treatment and rights against their husbands. All this stuff begins to be thrown out. All these pamphlets begin to be produced throughout the public sphere. One after another begins to float out, and it's really it's also in this period where England does a very crucial thing. It establishes a massive navy, a massive standing navy. That is, it's not simply going to have, its policy is now a permanent naval policy. It's not simply going to be, you allow some private ships to do whatever they want to, and then when you need them, you contract them out. You set up a shipbuilding industry in London. You set up a shipbuilding industry in your ports, and you build a permanent navy, right? You build a permanent navy. It's also in this period that England goes to war with the Netherlands. First, it proposes a unification scheme with the Netherlands. The English revolutionaries in the late 1640s and early 1650s travel to The Hague and to Amsterdam, to the Dutch Republic. They want to create a Protestant commercial union where the economies and the polities of England and the Netherlands are unified. The Dutch reject this, particularly because the Dutch will have no benefit from the commercial footing that England is proposing, and parity will be very bad for them, and a whole series of other reasons. And in light of that, England declares war, because it decides if it wants to have access to the best markets, the Dutch, who have already outcompeted everyone and out-innovated everyone over the past 80 years, have started to try and claim monopolies in those markets. So the only way you can demonopolize those markets and open them up to English entrepreneurship and innovation is to blow them open. And it's this period where the Navigation Acts and the Anglo-Dutch War is declared in, I believe, 1651. The Navigation Acts are founded in 1651, and the Navy is set on a permanent footing. And what's really important is this commits England away from an old regime, let's build up our standing army and bureaucracy and participate in continental balance of warfare, and instead shifts England to, let's do everything we can to preserve the balance of power on the continent, but let's have permanent maritime exploration, a permanent navy, permanent colonial exploration. Let's fight the Dutch to blow their market monopolies out from Indonesia to Brazil. Let's create a navigation act that establishes a colonial system that ensures a triangular trade of permanent commerce and shipping between England, West Africa, the West Indies, and North America. All of these things get off the ground. It is not geographic determinism. England's an island, and so therefore it had to be maritime and commercial. It's this bourgeois revolutionary explosion, right, that essentially opens up the gate from England to move out of this pursuit of becoming a land-based, territorial, dynastic old regime to become this massive maritime commercial empire. And it's in this period that England receives that orientation. And it's, again, even though this is policy being driven by merchants and manufacturers and the very radical bourgeois elites that have been allied with these radical plebeians who've led the civil wars and tried the monarch. Even though they're the ones that set and train this policy, you can't simply think of it as profit motivation. Because profit motivation by private enterprise is secondary to this bourgeois society. It's the mass of humanity that reproduces itself now, not through producing for its own consumption, but through going out into the market, into the world of the individual now self-relates with other human beings through this mass of humanity called the market, this mass of emancipated slaves called the market. It's that world in which the individual reproduces himself. And it's that world that drives, as Adam Smith points out in Book 1, the process of the gains from trade, specialization, the growth of the division of labor. With the growth of the division of labor, the growth of the market. With the growth of the market, the reaction back on the division of labor. And this is in the length and breadth of humanity. It's not simply being driven by a merchant sitting there in London and having to form policy in this new Commonwealth Parliament and say, I want my private interests, my private profits. That's an element of it, but it's secondary to the need to reproduce emancipated humanity in England. And that requires that you have more markets to sell to, more markets in which to produce raw materials to work up in your native industries, because people are being driven by the wage labor form. If you want to extend and universalize and generalize the slave revolt against caste society, you must have more markets to sell more goods to, because that is the only thing that's going to drive economic growth at home. That's the only thing that's going to drive more investment in plant and stock, which is going to drive more jobs, more wages to be paid out. The more wage laborers you have, the more knock-on effects throughout the economy. The more lawyers can be employed, more dentists can be employed, more retailers can be employed. The more of those that can be employed, this incredible knock-on effect, right, where the slave revolt of humanity that has been achieved in Western Europe becomes politically constituted. All right, and that's what the English Revolution of the 1640s and 1650s is the conscious attempt by these increasingly this is a tautology. It becomes the increasingly self-conscious attempt by the revolutionaries under people like Oliver Cromwell. But these revolutionaries are not just merchants. They're merchants, manufacturers, and some really radical bourgeois landlords linked with urban plebeians and rural yeomen who've been driving them to grasp on to the emancipatory forms of economic, social, political, and intellectual life coming out of the breakdown of traditional civilization. But it's only when those self-conscious bourgeois revolutionaries, it's only when they consciously sought to extend the limited forms of emancipation they were experiencing in growing commercial society that we can speak of something like bourgeois society. Let me say that again because it's worth emphasizing. England in the 1640s and 1650s becomes a bourgeois society. Why? Because the bourgeois revolution of the 1640s and 1650s constituted bourgeois society politically. What does it mean to constitute bourgeois society politically? It means that the mass of English humanity and its connections throughout Europe and the world was experiencing the emancipatory elements in the breakdown of late medieval agrarian civilization and the rise of the commodity form of labor, and increasingly self-consciously strove to increase that breakdown, to increase that crisis, to smash that traditional agrarian order, and to expand and generalize and universalize the commodity form of labor, the society based on independent individuals, emancipated slaves, free men and women, exchanging the products of their labor for the products of other people's labor. All right? It was that self-conscious decision that then politically constituted the English Commonwealth. All right? Now, there is an increasing breakdown of the English Commonwealth because you have increasing radicalization. There's these proto-primitive communist groups. There's this desire for universal suffrage. These even more radical claims come out, and this broad coalition against royal absolutism, this broad coalition of plebeians and merchants, manufacturers, radical landlords, begins to break down. And essentially what happens is Oliver Cromwell, who had been the leader of the revolt against the monarchy, who had overseen the abolition of the monarchy, the House of Lords, and the Church of England, and created a relatively religiously tolerant, open commercial society, he leads the New Model Army to crush the left-wing radical levelers, diggers. They're these really anarcho-radical Christian sects that want to abolish property, establish universal manhood suffrage. He leads a crushing of them. But this demand, and this is really important, okay? Here at the kind of dawn of a self-conscious bourgeois republic, of an increasingly self-conscious bourgeois republic, you have established a pretty liberal society that experiences, okay, amongst its plebeian elements, a push for an even more democratic form of life. And you already experience here in a very, it's mostly expressed in terms of radical Protestant Christianity, but you already begin to experience the tensions between liberalism and democracy, right? Which are forms of life bound up with the emergence of bourgeois society, which are forms of life that genuinely seek to deepen and extend the emancipation bound up with the commodity form of labor, with the rise of bourgeois society. And when Cromwell puts the diggers and the levelers and the even more radical elements of his own New Model Army to the sword, we can see that as the emergence of a tension between liberalism and democracy the emergence of a tension between differing ways to try and deepen and extend and master the dynamics of bourgeois society that's only going to extend all the way through to the 19th century. But that attempt to put them to the sword does not actually constitute a happy-go-lucky, stable bourgeois republic. It leads to an almost recurrent phase of instability. Eventually, Cromwell, by 1653, has to end the Commonwealth and declare a military dictatorship. That lasts from 1653 to 1658. Then, in 1658, he dies. His kind of ne'er-do-well and less competent son takes over, Richard Cromwell, and then eventually he flees and the Republic is reestablished between 1659 and 1660. But by 1660, so much of the population is sick of the dynamic of growing plebeian radicalism, crushed by elements of the parliamentary republic, crushed by the New Model Army. This kind of dynamic of radical democratic claims, standing army, military dictatorship, parliamentary republic. It's cycling in this period between radical democratic claims, parliamentary republican stability, and authoritarian military dictatorship. It's in this cycle. And eventually much of the population breathes a sigh of relief and asks the eldest son of the last Stuart monarch of England and Scotland, Charles I, to return. And so in 1660, Charles II returns to London as an anointed the King of England and the King of Scotland and the King of Wales. And the Restoration comes. Now there's a major problem with this. You have a long period of what could be called the kind of English Thermidor between 1660 and 1688, because the Stuarts come back, but there's no agreement. It's not like 1648-49. Where a parliamentary republic was put into place. Simply, people are exhausted. This period of parliamentary, republican, oligarchic stability, followed by radical democratic claims, followed by military dictatorship, followed by blah, blah, blah. This constant period of oligarchic stability, military dictatorship, radical democracy, toppling one after another leads to population exhaustion, the inviting back of the Stuarts. The monarchy was restored in 1660, but nobody agrees on a political settlement. What does that mean? Well, it's not that they're some kind of Dr. Evils, but Charles II and his younger brother James II immediately begin attempting to pursue the policy of establishing a royal despotism. That is, they look at the society and they see its massive instability, and they decide the only way to possibly be able to provide it with any stability is a royal despotism with which they can rule without parliament, they can rule without reference to the popular press or to mass riots or to any kind of wider, extra-political, extra-monarchical check on their authority. But again, in order to do so, in order to have the revenues and the power and the stability they want, they reinforce many aspects of the English bourgeois revolution. James II reinforces the building of the Navy. They extend the search for new markets. They extend British maritime imperialism. So they again pursue this project of trying to create an old regime royal despotism. But in doing so, they further and deepen and extend the proletarianization, the commercialization, the urbanization of English society. And so what happens essentially is that there's a kind of Deus ex machina, a gift of the gods that comes in 1688, which is the capitalist landlords. And now I would say, since you've had the English bourgeois revolution, that is between 1648 and 1653, you had the English bourgeois revolution. So now we can speak of a bourgeois society because we have an increasingly politically self-conscious bourgeois society. Even though it ended in military dictatorship and recurrent regimes being toppled and eventually the restoration of the monarchy, you now have a bourgeois society because there's no going back. And you have the attempt to graft the royal despotism onto a bourgeois society under Charles II and James II. But what's really, really vital to understand is the capitalist landlords and the merchants and manufacturers are really, really nervous because Charles and his younger brother James, in between 1660 and 1688, have been trying to create an old regime royal despotism that rules without parliament, that can use the royal state to intervene arbitrarily, to tax commercial life, to tax manufacturing production, right? To have a royal despotism based on a standing army and a massive bureaucracy. And they're not doing this because they're evil. They're doing this because they genuinely think it's necessary for social stability and geopolitical power. And it is necessary for social stability and geopolitical power. If you look out at the Dutch Republic, The Dutch Republic, even though it was able to hold off the King of Spain, it was never able to really prevent or to successfully hegemonize European statecraft. It's just one more player in European statecraft, right? And so the Stuarts decide they need this old regime absolutism. They begin pursuing it, and the radical landlords and merchants and manufacturers begin to become extremely nervous. And they're worried about, again, mobilizing the plebeian masses. Although many elements of plebeian masses are themselves becoming mobilized. You have very radical sects breaking out, both religious and secular now. In the 1680s, you have radical sectarian plots made up of both elites and genuine plebeian elements to try and kill Charles II and James II that are violently repressed. You have an invasion that comes, invading force in 1685 that's violently repressed. What happens, though, is essentially the British elite is able to invite William III, the stadtholder of the Dutch Republic, the prince of the Dutch Republic, over at the head of a European army made up mostly of Dutch-speaking, Danish-speaking, German-speaking Europeans to come and unthrone James II. And the kind of genius move here is you can have a revolution without having a revolution. That's the key to the Glorious Revolution of 1688. That is, bourgeois society has already been constituted, and by bringing over this European army to dethrone James, you essentially can have him removed without the capitalist landlords and the merchants and the manufacturers having to mobilize sections of the urban masses to remove the monarch, and thus realize a potentially infinite open-ended radical process. All right? Now, but what's going to happen? Why doesn't William III just become an absolutist? Well, he is largely concerned with foreign policy. He wants the Dutch Republic, when he comes over to England, the Dutch Republic is on the point of being swallowed up by the great old regime agrarian despotism, Bourbon France. And he desperately needs English resources to help him in that war. And the reason why he finds it attractive to lead a European army to remove James II from power is because he can gain the resources to preserve his own tiny, beloved bourgeois republic, the Dutch Republic, from being overrun by agrarian, royal, despotic, standing army France. And so he comes over, and his main interest is resources against France. And essentially what happens is the English bourgeoisie convinces him that by subscribing to parliamentary rule, that is, by increasingly subjecting the crown to ever-increasing forms of parliamentary scrutiny, Parliament will be able to raise revenues that no one's ever imagined before. How do they do this? Parliament in 1694, so William III has come over in 1688 with the European army. James II has fled. James II and his wife William III and his wife Mary II are declared King and Queen of England. You have this glorious revolution because it's fairly bloody. But why shouldn't William become an absolutist? Well, he cares about having money to preserve the Dutch Republic from despotic France. Right? That's what he wants. The Dutch Republic is about to be devoured by French standing armies. There's a massive war going on the continent in the late 17th century. And so what happens is that the Parliament establishes the Bank of England in 1694. What's the Bank of England? It's the first modern national debt system. It says Parliament will raise a debt subscription. It will send out a subscription for £4 million sterling, £8 million sterling, £40 million sterling. It will open books, and people from all over England, shopkeepers, artisans, middling merchants, petty manufacturers, wealthy merchants, ship captains, will come and subscribe whatever they can to Parliament. And in turn, that money will go immediately to William. What do these people get back? They get treasury bills that give them the right to collect an interest payment from the state. Where does that interest payment come from? Earmarks on future tax revenues. Okay? Again, just to level this out, 1694, Bank of England public debtor founded. This means now Parliament has the right to give the Bank of England the right to open subscription books. So all these people can come in with their abstract payment means, money, subscribe money to the bank. What does the bank do with that money? It turns over and gives it to the state. Parliament, and through Parliament to the Crown. What do the people get who subscribe? They get a treasury bill that says you have this much in the debt and this entitles you to this much yearly interest payment. And this entitles you, this interest payment comes from future tax revenues on market transactions, that is commercial excise and customs tax, taxes on commercial and industrial enterprise. Now, this all just seems like a bunch of technical language, but what this essentially does is it constitutes the first unified capitalist state in world history. Why does it do that? It does it for the following reasons. Parliament, which is a transparent body, it has debate. It's based to an important degree, although it has a caste lineage in the landed class. That landed class has been converted to a bourgeois class. Furthermore, it has open debate based to an important degree on rational persuasion. They themselves are subject to elections in their rural counties in which only very few men can vote, but anybody has the right to riot and publish a pamphlet and attempt to influence it. So Parliament is this immense public body. Parliament is a kind of institutionalized public sphere, open, rational debate about politics and policy. Parliament is not a private court, a shadow court, where a king and a few courtiers debate what the dynasty is going to do. It's an open institution of the realm that has debate between individuals elected. And what Parliament is saying is, all right, Parliament is saying, he's saying to the Crown, if you give us control over all domestic policy, that is, if you submit the domestic policy to us, we will give you as much revenue as you want. And what William is realizing is that he can pursue his wars, he can pursue whatever policy he wants, because Parliament is giving him more money from this bourgeois world of commerce and manufacturing that's ever come from the old agrarian world. And so he's willing, because he has the money to pursue his wars, to give more and more domestic control to Parliament. Now, why are people subscribing to the national debt? People are subscribing to the national debt because it guarantees Parliament's role in the state. Parliament raises the revenues. The Crown only gets those revenues insofar as Parliament raises them, and Parliament's only going to raise them the degree to which the Crown cedes control of policy and domestic life to Parliament. Why do people want Parliament to be in control rather than the Crown? Because Parliament is the transparent body based on elections, based on public sphere debate, based on rational persuasion that people can influence. Whether it's a wage laborer, a plebeian, whether it's a merchant or a manufacturer, they can influence this body to pursue policies better for bourgeois society as a whole. A West India merchant can say, hey, I'll give you £5,000 sterling, Parliament, if, when you take over this policy from the king, you make sure that you use the Navy at least part of the time to protect sea routes to the West Indies, which help my enterprises. And by the way, I can make sure this happens because I can see transparent parliamentary debate and I can influence other candidates against you if you don't follow through on this policy. And so what happens is this dynamic process where growing bourgeois commercial manufacturing society loans money to Parliament in order to reinforce Parliament's transparent and open role in the state. And Parliament, in turn, gives money to the Crown in return for its increasing control over domestic and economic policy. And it uses its increasing control over domestic and economic policy to listen to bourgeois society and to transform statecraft in the interest of bourgeois society. So, without any businessman sitting in Parliament, without a single manufacturer sitting in Parliament in the year 1700, you have a thoroughly unified capitalist state. A state whose political order is no longer independent of commercial society, but only draws its life and breath from the reproduction of bourgeois society. It must, if it wants tax revenues, it must have economic growth. If it wants economic growth, if Parliament wants influence in the state over the Crown, over policy, it must be able to demonstrate tax revenues and loans. If it wants to demonstrate loans and tax revenues, it must be committed to economic growth, so merchants, manufacturers, financiers, shopkeepers, ship captains, artisans, give it money. All right? And this dynamic process starts to occur without anyone seeing where essentially, by 1720, Parliament is in control of the state. And Parliament is committed towards one thing, the reproduction of bourgeois society at home and abroad. And this is really absolutely vital and important. If you look at the national debt, remember, the national debt is skyrocketing. It is a larger debt than has ever been seen in human history. By 1763, the debt stands at £130 million sterling. That may not sound like a lot today, but it is the largest debt anyone's seen in his history. Every other European monarch who had that debt declared bankruptcy or crashed. And it just keeps growing and growing and growing, permanent indebtedness, because it's a symptom of a state that is devoted to the reproduction and expansion of bourgeois society. And what's really, really important now is the English state doesn't look at external relations as conquer land and conquer dominion over men. It looks at external relations, extend naval routes, find new commercial markets, find new places to settle colonies to produce raw materials to be worked up in industry back home. That is really, in a way the Dutch Republic only began to do. English imperialism becomes radically bourgeois. That is, it becomes committed towards the global expansion of the slave revolt within England. That is, England has experienced social emancipation, the generalization of the wage labor form, the generalization of emancipated humanity exchanging the product of its labor with one another. That emancipated humanity has managed to take over its state and transform it into a bourgeois state through parliamentary sovereignty, and is now using that bourgeois state to expand its power and reproduce itself abroad. Find new markets, create new sea lanes, create new colonies to produce raw materials, so as to be able to drive economic growth, to expand investment, to allow for more wage labor jobs to accrue, for more people to be employed in them, for them to go out in society with their disposable income and spend left, right, and center and have all these knock-on effects. So that the British Empire by 1720 has become the British state, the British parliamentary state, and the vast global empire it oversees that stretches from commercial port cities in Bengal all the way through to the slave plantations of the West Indies and the colonial farm settlements of New England, has become just a big giant engine for the reproduction of bourgeois society at home and abroad. And it is a human roller coaster. It is generating levels of prosperity and wealth that humanity has never, ever seen before. And this is really, really vital. England is the highest taxed population in the 18th century, English men and women. Why are they the highest taxed? Actually, if you look at their tax incident, that is the state's legal right, what the state can actually tax them for, it's not much. But here's the difference. English men and women pay about 90 to 95% of the taxes they owe, because they're paying it to a parliamentary state that they see as reproducing the bourgeois society that their emancipation is bound up with. And they're willing to pay their taxes. France, Austria, and Prussia collect between 40 to 50% of the taxes they legally can. And to collect them, they have to build big standing armies to go with intendants into the provinces. And guess what? You just have to have more revenues. Because if you've got to extract forcefully 50% of your revenues from your peasantry, you've got to have more revenues to extract that 50%. So it's just a self-fulfilling cycle of fiscal collapse. And so England is able to create this money, and it creates this naval empire, and it essentially, the English empire, all right, enters into the geopolitical game. But here's how it's fundamentally different from the Dutch Republic, guys. It doesn't simply carve out a space for itself within the bourgeois order of things. Oh, sorry, the old regime interstate order of things. It's not like the Dutch Republic. It doesn't just preserve itself. This unified capitalist state, overseeing an empire devoted to the reproduction of bourgeois social relations at home and abroad, is now sending shockwaves, consciously and unconsciously, throughout the world. And these shockwaves are not just disrupting old regime Europe, they're disrupting every settled agricultural civilization left on the planet and every hunter-gatherer civilization left on the planet. England is now pursuing a maritime empire. It will not settle for simply having no other. It wants access to every market the world has to offer. It uses its navy, essentially, to dominate the seas. By the mid-18th century, the goal of English statecraft is to have unparalleled domination of the sea. But it's not like an army that shows up in your country and conquers you. It's a navy atop floating land, water. that simply does not conquer people, but coercively blows open a space for the unfettered flow of English capital, ships, and labor throughout the world. The unfettered expansion of English bourgeois society. Indeed, of bourgeois society as such. And that's what it's devoted itself for, this immense, immense reproduction, and it wants every market open. It's exploring South China Sea. East India companies exploring South China Sea. It's pushing into the interior. It's going everywhere. English colonists in the New World are pushing further into the North American interior, making deals with Native American tribes. It wants more slaves to work in its plantations of the West Indies, and it's making more deals with West African chieftains and kingdoms to collect prisoners of war to take to the West Indies. It's making more deals with South Asian Nawabs and South Asian sovereigns to have more market access. It has this unquenchable thirst to expand this emancipated humanity, this universal exchange of labor to everywhere it can go, and slowly, in doing so, to be able to blow open, it needs to use massive coercion, the Navy, to blow open this world market so that it has the free flow of capital. And its principal enemies in this are places like Austria, Spain, and France. And what we see in the 18th century, in the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasts from 1701 to 1714, and then the War of Austrian Succession, which lasts from 1740 to 1748, and then the 7 Years' War, which lasts from 1756 to 1763, we see England simply running the tables increasingly against everyone. And it's not just England running the table, Britain running the tables against everyone. It's not just England paying mercenaries. Remember, basically what England is doing is paying mercenaries to keep the old regime powers, Austria, Prussia. The key old regime powers by the mid-18th century, let's say by the 1740s and 50s, are Prussia, Austria, France, and Spain. What is it doing? This is what it does. It thinks France is getting too strong. It subvents financially a coalition. Right? It subvents financially a coalition against France. The minute Prussia and that coalition starts getting too strong, it starts paying France to fight Prussia. That's why England gets known. It gets all these European aristocratic statesmen hate England in the 18th century. It's referred to as perfidious Albion. Right? It's why Napoleon famously, Smith says it as a positive valorization, but Napoleon famously says it's a nation of shopkeepers. They have no interest but interest. They're not fighting for any higher principle of religion. It's just simply keeping a balance of power that lets them perpetuate their commercial society. But England literally begins to shift balance left and right. It's not anymore about some kind of great dynastic links. It's about keeping a balance of power and making sure nobody can create a universal monarchy again, and simply allowing yourself world access to markets and sea lanes. And what happens is it's funding all these coalitions against one another on the continent, and it's allowing them to fight each other to death while it conquers every market and sea lane. Conquer meaning higher quality, lower cost goods. Initially, it shows up and it says, you won't let me trade here, I'll blow you open with gunboats. Because once I can trade here, I have lower cost and higher caliber goods that can, through market transactions, blow away the alternatives. And it's this England that begins to send shockwaves. Because what's happened is old regime Europe begins to enter into deep fiscal collapse. By 1763, Austria, Prussia, and above all France are teetering on total bankruptcy. And they're beginning to have to look inwards and think about what are they going to do to stay in this great power game to have any chance. And they're beginning to try to both encourage even more. They're looking at the Netherlands and now England, and they're saying, why are we behind? It's because of our less developed forms of commercial life. We have less innovators, we have less manufacturers, we have less cities. And so you see French, Spanish, Austrian, Prussian aristocratic statesmen try and introduce new forms of bourgeois life, literally overnight, and to try and reinforce existing ones. On the other hand, they're in immense tax debt and fiscal overstretch, and they begin to talk about doing things like taxing the aristocracy. It's in the third lecture, you'll see taxing the aristocracy in France essentially is the trigger for the French Revolution. In other words, the old regime, what England is posing, what England is forcing the old regime to Europe to do is to say, you can no longer stand with one foot in the old world and one foot in the new world. You must choose. And if you don't choose, and you don't choose the new world, we'll do it for you. That is, every old regime must choose whether or not it is to become bourgeois or it is to perish. Remember Marx and Engels in the Manifesto. The expanding bourgeois world says to the barbarian races, right, in Marx and Engels' lines, right, become bourgeois on the point of death. This is what England is saying to the aristocrats and the clerics and the monarchs of the old regime. Sometimes self-consciously, sometimes not self-consciously. All right? That's really vital and really key and really important. But, by the way, now this warfare that's been growing, if I had a map for you, which I'm sorry I didn't bring, you would see from the War of the Spanish Succession, starting in 1701, through to the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, warfare is not just in Europe. It's grown across the world. In fact, Winston Churchill famously calls the 7 Years' War, the later 1750s and 60s, the First World War. It's known as the French and Indian War in the New World. It starts 2 years earlier in 1754. But what's happening now is the last hunter-gatherer civilizations, like the Iroquois, that are aligning with the British, are benefiting from the defeat of the French and are benefiting at the expense of their competitor hunter-gatherer societies. The South Asian Nawabs, these great civilized agricultural post-Neolithic monarchs, are benefiting by aligning with the English against the French. In other words, they're not just forcing. England is not just forcing the old regime Europe to have to choose, are you bourgeois or are you dead? Do you become self-consciously bourgeois or do you perish with every other chivalric, noble, medieval value, right? It's also drawing in all these other settled agricultural civilizations. The Safavid dynasty in Persia, the Mughal dynasty in South Asia, the Iroquois, and I'm who's the key French ally? I can't believe I'm forgetting against the Iroquois in the New World. Can't believe I'm forgetting this. I'm drawing a blank. Sorry, it's not the Hurons. I can't remember who it is. But it's drawing in all these other forms of life that aren't bourgeois. The old regime is still kind of, remember, it's been involved in this crisis of late medieval civilization. So it remains partially bourgeois, but also trying to stay in the old world. It's forcing them to consider this, but now it's forcing these hunter-gatherer and settled agricultural societies that are really on the margins of the bourgeois world, that have not meaningfully experienced the breakup of agrarian civilization. They begin to experience the breakup of their traditional forms overnight as they get drawn into this, right? What the Prussian monarchy experiences in a period of 100 years, right? The Nawab of Bengal is going to have to experience in a period of about 5. And he didn't get to go through 200 years of the breakdown of settled agricultural life, the emergence of aspects of the commodity form of labor, and some bourgeois revolution that politically constitutes a merchant bourgeois society. He has to go from a settled agricultural life that has existed from 10,000 years to being immediately involved in the affairs of the most radical bourgeois society that's ever existed. And so what we see is the world is being compressed into this gigantic radical bourgeois pressure cooker. Now, meanwhile, and to conclude, what is going on at home in England? Well, what's going on at home in England is that by 1763, not radical religious groups, but rather genuinely radical democratic secular groups, above all under the name of people like William Beckford and John Wilkes, have began to demand the radicalization of bourgeois right. That is, they have said, okay, only these capitalist landlords and a few great merchants sit in control of the parliamentary state. It may be broadly representative of Parliament, right? It may be broadly representative of Parliament, but it is not representative of all of the industrial and commercial wealth and private property that goes into this great bourgeois imperial machine. And it must become more representative. And so what starts to happen in the 1750s and 60s at home is middling merchants, smaller manufacturers, tradesmen, people who generally have commercial and industrial private property but are not able to sit in a landed estate, begin to demand the extension of the vote. But while they demand the extension of the vote in the 1760s, it becomes immediately radicalized And plebeian groups begin to demand the extension of the vote. Genuine wage laborers demand the right to form unions. They demand to form what's known in the 1760s as combinations to raise their wages. We see sailors, we see weavers, we see spinners demand the right not only to vote, they've got these middling merchant manufacturer superiors that want the right to vote for the landed parliament. Now they also want that right. So we see the even further radicalization of bourgeois right, just not in the universalization of the vote, but of the right to create unions, of the right of the only property they have, their wage labor. Remember, the wage laborer can only really assert meaningful control over his property, his wage laborer collectively. It's only through unionizing that the proletariat can become a successful bourgeois subject. I mean, it's only through radicalizing his bourgeois subjectivity, through creating a single bourgeois subject, the collective commodity owner of the union, that the wage laborer can sort of fully control the means to dispose of the product of his labor in the market, his labor power, in the market. And so you have the radicalization of bourgeois right. And this is not just, crucially, this is happening in London, in Bristol, in Manchester, in Birmingham, Edinburgh, and Glasgow. But it's also happening in these colonies across the sea that are something like English commercial society without the feudal lineage. It's happening in Charleston. It's happening in Philadelphia. It's happening in New York. It's happening in Boston. And it's these areas, even more so than England, because they have no feudal lineage. They're literally little mini bourgeois societies created overnight. They were born in the English Revolution in the 17th century. They were born from Puritans fleeing prosecution. They established their freedoms within a general imperial framework during the English Revolution in the mid-17th century, during the Glorious Revolution. And they've been burgeoning into these dynamic urban commercial industrial centers. If you were to compare Bristol to Boston, you would have dynamic proto-industrial commercial urban centers. But the difference is this: you would still have lots of feudal lineages and lots of landed elites in the countryside around demanding a lot of control and supervision in Liverpool. But in Boston, you have maybe commercial agriculturalists, but no huge aristocrats demanding control and influence and demanding to manage the system. You also have very, very little in the way of any preserve of the caste system. None of the tripartite caste of those who work, those who pray. Everybody in the colonies are those who work. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson might come from wealthy planter families, but everybody knows their money came from work and exchange. They don't come from a family tree. The Duke of Newcastle may be rooted in capitalist landlordism, but he ultimately justifies his status in society as this family tree. None of the great planters of Virginia are a family tree. They all come from rabble of the 17th century, and everyone knows it. It is a pure society of the Third Estate, become radically bourgeois in a plebeian and a bourgeoisie sense of the term. And it's in these areas, really first lit by English radicals in the 60s and 70s, the demand starts to say, hey, if the middling sort, if the manufacturers and merchants in England are saying we have the right to vote for Parliament. In other words, if you think about it this way, Parliament was representative of bourgeois society, but once bourgeois society develops even further, under the auspices of the post-Glorious Revolution state, Parliament has developed England to such a degree, there are so many more merchants and manufacturers. Remember, it's the bourgeois revolution that creates the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It's not the bourgeoisie that creates the bourgeois revolution. And England, after the Glorious Revolution, goes from being roughly 30 to 40% commercial manufacturing to something like 50 to 60% commercial manufacturing. So the Glorious Revolution has only sped up and generalized urbanization, proletarianization, commercialization, proto-industrialization, has only spread it up further. So new social interests are coming into being. Manufacturers and merchants are beginning to feel even more powerful, demanding not simply that Parliament represent them, but that they actually sit and vote and participate in Parliament. And people in America have been seeing that. And now people in America have been, or in the British North America, have been seeing plebeians demanding this stuff, right? Genuine plebeians demanding that and unionization. And it's in that context that you get the cry of no taxation without representation. That it's in the wake of the 7 Years' War that there's a massive national debt accumulated when Britain runs the tables against France in 1759. in the midst of the 7 Years' War, defeats France everywhere. But in doing so, it collects this huge debt, and it's really nervous that it's going to take a lot of time for economic growth at home to recuperate the debt. So what it tries to do is to ship the debt off of its domestic sphere and onto the colonies who have no formal rights. And suddenly, these colonists are getting these newspapers and getting letters from cousins and brothers and sisters and wives saying the middling sorts and the plebeians are demanding their rights as private property owners and bourgeois subjects. I'm using my term, not theirs, right? As commodity owners, they're demanding their right in the state. They're demanding their right at the level of political representation. And now the tax burden's been shifted off in the colonies. And they're now viewing this taxation without any representation. They now have this huge tax burden. After a war, they've also fought the French in. They fought alongside with their imperial British brothers and sisters. And now their imperial British brothers and sisters pushing the tax burden off on them, and they begin to demand for the first time, this has never happened before, that a colony settled across an ocean suddenly said, we have the same rights as the most radical claims in the mother country. We're not just some thing to be milked, right? We are a part of this, and they're able to do it on the basis that they're part of this massive commercial empire, maritime empire, that's devoted to the reproduction of social relations. They've been exchanging freely at their own will values of equal possessions. They've been involved in this emancipated form of humanity and its reproduction through liberty and equality, and they are now also demanding this right, okay? And what's really key in conclusion is this is essentially the long-term origins of the American Revolution, because it is this moment, what this moment essentially poses. All right, then the third lecture will pick up with this. What this moment poses profoundly is this. If you look at England in the year 1763, where this lecture is supposed to end, you have basically a modern capitalist oligarchy. You have not all of the capitalist classes involved in the political order, but the richest elements of the capitalist class, the capitalist landlords, the highest merchants and financiers run the state. They run it for but they run the state in the interest of reproduction of bourgeois society as a whole, right? But they're experiencing this threat, right? So you have basically a liberal or proto-liberalizing society, and they begin to experience this threat from middling sort and genuinely plebeian and colonial forms of bourgeois democracy. And they experience this threat as a potential threat, not simply from greed, from wanting to control the state and being authoritarian, but also they see this as a threat to private property, as a threat to the liberal individual and private property, the mass enfranchisement of middling sort plebeians who might even, and these plebeian groups are demanding infringements on private property, higher taxes. I mean, Thomas Paine writes all these pamphlets saying, higher taxes for what we call proto-welfare state. All of these kinds of things. In other words, you're getting a kind of tension between a proto-liberal society of genuine individuals and private property and an increasing bourgeois democratic demand for collective forms of social freedom. And what's beginning to happen is the question being posed across the British Empire, and indeed increasingly in Europe in this time period, is the following. Is bourgeois society ultimately a means or an end? And a related question, is bourgeois society an endpoint or simply one point in human historical development? Let me just say what I mean by that briefly. What's happening is essentially this. Bourgeois society, the universalization of the exchange of labor, right? It is being understood as entering into a profound period of crisis. And what is going to confront people throughout the British Empire and indeed throughout Europe at this period is, was bourgeois society a means? That is, a means to an end, happiness, wider forms of emancipation, ever-increasing degrees of individual and collective freedom? Or was bourgeois society the end, right? A capitalist state heavily influenced by financiers, landlords, manufacturers, merchants, a plebeian mass, extremely discontent, demanding combinations, these kinds of things. I mean, a real question is coming on the lines here. Is bourgeois society the pursuit of private profit, the pursuit of wage labor, the pursuit of interest, the pursuit of rent, the pursuit of all of these kinds of things, the way that humans relate to one another through the universal exchange of labor? Is this the end point of human development? Right? is this simply, this is the end? Society has just become about the reproduction of this social order, or is this simply a means to opening up ever greater degrees of collective and individual freedom? Now, the key to this is the American Revolution begins to pose this question, and taking up arms. The British middle class and plebeians, essentially, there's no other way to call it. They blink. They blink at the standpoint of this crisis. They're really afraid of the Pandora's box at risk opening to enter into arms against the established political order in Britain. The colonists do not blink, right? But it's really not until the French Revolution and the radical phase of the French Revolution that this question is most clearly posed, which is, were the bourgeois revolutions about establishing the final phase of human history, that is bourgeois society, the universal exchange of labor, or were they about simply opening up one more step that could be one more step on a ladder to ever greater degrees of individual and collective freedom? And that's really important, and that's why, together, the period from the Dutch Revolt in 1568 through to the outbreak of the radical phase of the French Revolution in 1793 and 94 is genuinely this period where there's a real belief, increasingly self-conscious, that one fights revolutions in order to use the commodity form of labor and the emerging aspects of bourgeois society as means with which to advance individual and collective freedom. In other words, one uses bourgeois society, capital, the commodity form, as a means to advance one's humanity's project of individual and collective freedom. But it's starting to happen towards the end of this period in the 1770s, 80s, 90s that something else begins to emerge, which is the potential that what seems like a means to an end, bourgeois society, the commodity form of labor, capital, as a means towards ever-increasing individual and collective freedom, is being reversed. And humanity is becoming the means for the reproduction of the end, which is capital. That is, that humanity, rather than the commodity form of labor and bourgeois society and capital becoming the means for humanity to fulfill itself infinitely at an individual and collective level, rather humanity is being subjected to the straitjacket and constraint of the reproduction of capital. That's what starts to open up, and that's what's going to, between the radical phase of the French Revolution and the revolutions of 1848, send bourgeois society at a global scale into a crisis from which we've never recovered. Because the question still remains to this day, is bourgeois society a means to an end of ever-increasing human happiness and freedom? Or is human happiness and freedom always going to be subject to the reproductive needs of capital? And that's the question that's still with us. And I'll pick up, this is the kind of long-term origins of the American Revolution. The next lecture picks up with the American Revolution. And I realize, guys, I'm sorry, I was hoping we'd have a full hour. I don't know if we don't have much time left. If we can get a few questions in, but to wherever the tolerate is. But there's a bar that we're going over to afterwards, right?
At the Tattooed Mall.
And people can ask questions. And I'm really sorry that I'd hoped to be over by 9, and I'm sorry it went way overboard. And I should have ended with the French-English conflicts, but I also want to kill the two birds with giving you guys something about the long-term origins of the American Revolution. So, three things. Let's take some questions now, but 2 things. I'll go over to Tattooed Mom, and I'll stay there until people are done asking questions. But also, honestly, I will take email questions. And also, the important thing is, I'm not doing these things alone. I mean, this comes out of an entire Platypus project of collective education. So there are many, many people in Platypus that would subscribe to probably no single individual of all of what I said. Nobody agrees on everything, but much of what I said and would be able to answer questions or try and discuss and debate objections. But let's at least see if we can get 3 questions here right now, and then let's take 3 in a row. Can we take 3?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay, I have a 2-part question.
Go ahead. Could somebody hand him this recorder?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, so about the question you asked about the final question about how is freedom tied to capital? Is this the end or not? It seems like you suggested. I'd like you to talk a little bit more about the importance of the idea you said where importing in the Glorious Revolution, importing the Dutch army of William III stopped a process of radicalization on the part of the population because they didn't have to, the merchants and all these people didn't have to recruit an army.
Right.
And I would like to see how important is that for subsequent developments and the development of a state. And also, how important is the development of nationalist ideas like the state ideas of Baudin and stuff like that in the development of the English, French, and American context. The other question I wanted to ask, though, is how does the slave trade fit into this discussion? Like, specifically in the U.S., comparing the U.S. with like other colonies like Haiti, but specifically in the 1600s when it switched. Why did it switch from mainly white indentured servants to black slaves? And why are these bourgeois, this is a feudal system, but yet these bourgeois owners like Jefferson are dynamic and liberal?
Yeah.
You know, if you can connect that with the other thing, other question,
Okay.
I don't know if it's possible.
Sure. I think it's probably best to be realistic that I'll say this. Let me save the Jefferson question because generally the next lecture, I added post-1763 developments to this because of the kill two birds with one stone phenomenon. But truthfully, if you don't feel satisfied by what I say, if you can listen to the online recording, that's be done. It's going to be done next Thursday, 1763 to 1850, and we'll be up next Friday.
Sure.
And you generally feel all the post-1763 Jefferson questions were not answered, let me know, because it is. I try to address that in that lecture. I'm going to try to address that in that lecture. Couple of things. One, I view Jean Baudin very simply as the kind of perfect expression of the old regime, but in a way, though. He famously has this view of royal absolutism, which is it's the monarch that posits the law. But he has this radical argument for sovereignty, which is...
Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for coming. I appreciate it. So Jean Baudin has this famous expression where he says there must be an unrefutable source of sovereignty which can posit the law but not receive it. But he kind of falls on the side of the monarch being that. What I think Jean Baudin comes out of this period of state breakdown and religious war, where Protestants and Catholics are... So you'd have to go to France, 16th century France, and see the Catholic-Protestant civil wars, religious wars, and you'd have to see the external geopolitical pressures leading to state breakdown. And I think he thinks that the monarchy, freed from any check of local, aristocratic, or clerical oversight, is the only force that can provide the kind of stability necessary to preserve the old regime. But I view Jean Baudin as somebody that is a kind of ideological expression of the Janus-faced old regime. That is, he genuinely wants to resolve this growing crisis of society and state, but and in that sense he wants to preserve the old world on some level. But on the other hand, he advocates a principle of state sovereignty, sovereign centralization, that is going to drive the monopolization of the means of violence, that is going to destroy local privileges and jurisdictions, that is going to create territorially unified centralized states.
Therefore, in a way, the drivers of the French Revolution were tacitly accepting many of Baudin's ideas about the sovereignty of the state.
Well, there I would have I would say this. I would say that Jean Baudin is then transformed by Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes is then transformed by John Locke, and John Locke is then transformed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and it's only Rousseau, really. So insofar as the French revolutionaries care at all about Baudin, it's refracted 3 times, through Rousseau, through Locke, through Hobbes. And, by the way, each of those steps is self-consciously increasingly radical bourgeois. I mean, Hobbes is already really, I would say, a product of the bourgeois revolutionary upheaval of the English Civil Wars. He's already self-consciously bourgeois. Locke is the further, let's say, democratization, parliamentation of that perspective. And it's really Rousseau who creates an argument for a kind of a relationship between social and individual freedom that is not just contra Locke about the end of hostilities and the preservation about individual liberties, but the genuine created possibility of bourgeois society to both create new social orders, new forms of social freedom, and in turn allow for the creation of new types of individuals and individual freedom. So, but insofar as French revolutionaries care about Jean Bodin, I would really say it's refracted through Rousseau's Social Contract, Locke's Second Treatise, Hobbes' Leviathan. And in that sense, it's made, Jean Bodin wouldn't, already by the Hobbes level, he wouldn't have an idea what's going on. Final thing I'll say on the slave world, what's really important is, and I know you have a lot of other questions, and this is the only one I genuinely remembered. I should have written them down. On the slave question, you said, why did it switch to West African slavery? Very important. Obviously, by the 18th century, there's a increasingly racial understanding of West African slavery that seeks to justify it. But when West African slavery really took off the ground, what it had resulted from is they initially, in the southern eastern seaboard of the United States and the West Indies, they wanted to use European indentured servants. But what begins to happen in Britain, as bourgeois society develops in Britain, as manufacturing commerce develops, they emphasize on not letting the population leave. They want more hands to work in workshops. Right? They want more production. There's an emphasis on the growth of population at home, and there's a really strong discouragement of indentured servitude. So actually, if we look at early slavery, it's a patchwork of efforts to try and coerce Native Americans to be slaves. It's a patchwork of efforts to buy prisoners of war, and that's what they legitimately are originally, West African prisoners of war that were being sold before Europeans showed up and after Europeans showed up. Right? And that's a patchwork of that, and then European indentured servitude. You're essentially a slave for 5 years, then you're let go to become a small farmer. Right? It's a patchwork of those things, and it's in the failure of Native Americans for various reasons to do with the types of disease form Europeans bring. But largely, it's European indentured servitude is basically killed for two reasons. One, it's killed for internal European reasons because they need the hands at home. They want the hands in domestic manufacturing home. So ironically, it's the development of the most emancipated wage labor forms within Britain that behind the back encourages the development of West African slavery. And secondly, once Europeans have all this wealth and they start showing up to buy slaves, we see what had been a limited African slave trade based on you fight wars and you get prisoners of war, you sell the surplus into commerce, into trade, become for commerce sake. You go to war to get African slaves to be able to sell them to Europeans. So the European presence transforms the slave trade from a minimal, genuinely geopolitical inter-kingdom rivalry to actually a profit-seeking, we're going to, African chieftains going to war to get slaves to sell to Europeans. So, but I honestly think it's a kind of behind the back of the actors process that only over time develops this incredibly brutal racial justification that is not its initial motivation. I think we have time for one more before we switch to the bar. Scott.
I'm trying to get a long one, actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's kind of piggybacking on the beginning of, or Peter's first question. It has to do with sort of, like in the reading group we're examining, people who are taking like a critical view of bourgeois consciousness and trying to like reinvigorate, reimagine, specifically the concept of right. And so I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the concept of right, of bourgeois right, as it sort of develops through the Dutch Revolution up to the American Revolution, and the forms of political consciousness that go along with that. Specifically, the way, and sort of along with this, but similar but slightly different, the way that sort of mass politicization happens in, say, something like the American Revolution versus the Dutch, the different forms and the evolution of how plebeian broader politicization actually comes about.
That's a very good. I'll give two extremely crude answers that but I'll only give them on that so they can tell you more later. Which is basically the Dutch Revolt and the English Civil War, which both last a long time. The Dutch Revolt 80 years, the English Civil War 20. They initially are driven by this kind of evangelical, almost apocalyptic Protestant Christianity, largely Calvinist in both cases, and it's only in the middle of both of them that they become kind of what I would call self-consciously bourgeois. That is about religious toleration, economic growth, the generalization of wage labor, the destruction of commercial monopolies, the spread of free trade, the building of navies, the creation of market-based forms of taxation, these kinds of things, right? The American Revolution, I would say, is self-consciously secular and bourgeois from the beginning. It has religion as an element, but religion is an element within a radical bourgeois critique. Whereas a radical bourgeois critique develops out of a religious apocalyptic critique in the other two. Okay? And the French Revolution, above all, has even much more thoroughgoing secular and radical element. So that would be the first thing I would say. Now, the second thing I would say is that bourgeois right, that we can see in elements of the Dutch Revolt, but really I would say the first really clear example is when Cromwell puts down the radicals in his own army. You begin to see a tension between the claims of collective and individual freedom in the unfolding of the bourgeois revolutions themselves. That is, and I would consider these both claims of bourgeois right, collective freedom versus individual freedom. The desire for the levelers and the diggers to have universal manhood suffrage and even to have some rights to intervene on private property in the interests of social prosperity, of generalized social prosperity even amongst the poor. That goes into direct conflict with the leaders of the New Model Army who are individual private property owners, but who are genuinely concerned about the anarchy and chaos and despotism that could potentially lie in the right to infringe private property as the source of autonomy, the source of freedom in the world, right? And so I would genuinely say that there are elements in the Dutch Revolt, but really clearly expressed when Cromwell and the Puritan leaders of the New Model Army turned their guns after they killed the king, after they abolished the House of Lords, after they'd gotten rid of the Church of England. They turned their guns on the radicals in their own army, the radical Democrats in their own army, because for them, the claims of collective freedom, of universal manhood suffrage, and of demands to intervene on private property to spread social prosperity, they generally view this as a threat to autonomy and private property. It's a real freedom problem. I would say that there is both the potential... Oh, sorry.
Thank you.
Oh, okay. So it generally, but that is a real claim. That is the diggers and the levelers, in their pursuit of collective forms of freedom, universal suffrage and generalized social prosperity, pose a threat of collective despotism. And the leaders of the New Model Army and the kind of more general middling sort and upper plebeian elements that support them, they genuinely, in their desire to preserve private property, the wellsprings of growth that come from it, and the individual autonomy that's key to it, they genuinely want to preserve emancipation, but also that could lead to individual authoritarianism and the despotism of private property. So you begin to see this conflict of individual... In other words, I'm being extremely crude about this conflict between individual and collective forms of freedom. It's really the French Revolution lecture, because genuinely I think it's only there in the Dutch Revolt in bits and pieces, and I really think in the English Revolution it's highly complicated by the Protestant Christian puritanical character of it all. I would say, and even in the American Revolution, it's to a lesser extent, because America is in many respects an advanced social form because it has no feudalism, but it's also a backward social form in the sense that it's mostly farms and commerce. It has no manufacturing. It has a lot of middling and small scale property owners, whereas Europe's starting to have the genuine question of generalized wage labor in a way that America doesn't oppose. But I would say it's really the problem of bourgeois right as a conflict between collective freedom and individual freedom does not really come into its own in wholly secular terms until the radical phase of the French Revolution. And it's something that remains with us to this day. The struggle between liberalism and, well, put it this way, the struggle between I would say 1648 and 1794. You can see a struggle between liberalism and democracy in the emergence of bourgeois society, a struggle between individual freedom and collective freedom, and I would say post-1794, but much more importantly, post-1848 and post the Industrial Revolution, that struggle between liberalism and democracy is radicalized and transformed in the struggle between socialism and liberalism, right? The most advanced forms of collective and individual freedom. So that's how I would put that. But generally, if I can kind of also give you the answer I gave him, which is sort of save the more deeper probing of those things for the Danton, Robespierre, and actually, it's not just that talk. It's really, because even there, it's only going to just come out in vague terms. It's the final fourth part of the lecture, 1548. If you were to use something else I failed to say.
We've got to have it. But I
okay, sorry.
Just
all right. Well, thank you very much, James. Please give me a round of applause.
people are welcome, I guess, to email and ask questions.
And thank you all for coming. I hope that you found it provocative, illuminating, informative, and insightful with respect to the readings this summer. So please do feel free to join us now for drinks. Otherwise, good night.
Scott, what's the smart move here?
More specifically,
No, I'm taking your question, but what's the smart move? I'm sorry to do that, but
recording, just so I would stop the recording.
But how do